Welcome, everyone. We are here on March 14th, 2023 for a meeting of the Carrboro Town Council. This is a work session meeting, which explains the unusual arrangement of seating. I still think this is bizarre, but we'll figure it out. It's good to see everyone. Tonight, as I said, is a work session. We've got two really interesting items on the agenda tonight, some perennial favorites like parking, and then we'll talk about advisory boards. So we'll start with the parking item, and Mr. Manager, I don't know if we have a presentation by staff or...
Yes, Joel Hartman-Brown has a presentation for the parking study.
Great, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. All right. So we sent a copy of the parking study, the original parking study, in your packet. We also sent out an update as well, and the comments from the advisory boards on the parking study. So we'll jump right into it. We're going to talk about tonight in this presentation, we're going to talk about the parking study backgrounds as well as some of the key study findings, the public parking count update, which you have in your packet, the advisory board comments. Then we'll focus more specifically on the key recommendations of the initial study and talk a little bit about municipal service districts as well. So some background, the parking study. The parking study was originally presented to the council in April 20th, 2022. And the overall occupancy by walking zone, as you can see, varies in four different areas of the community. You can see that the public facilities experience overall peak usage on-street and off-street in various zones, and that the private facilities by various zones peaked at 50% occupancy when considering the demand. And this also is in your packet. And then when we take a look more specifically at the public parking by zone, we can see that three of the four zones are really varying in occupancy, but peaking mostly on the weekends on that Saturday period at 9 p.m. and 11 a.m. in Zone 1. And then, of course, for weekdays, really kind of peaking there at Zone 3, that kind of that central business area at 58% on 11 a.m. So some of the key study findings, vehicle turnover was in the public lots was very low. 50% of the vehicles exceeded the time limit, the 2-hour time limit. The public parking locations are not easy to locate, was one of the other findings. The 203 project provides sufficient parking for the new land uses anticipated, but when we consider the existing demand, it may present some challenges as well. ADA parking violation is considered low. At $50, the recommendation was around $200 to $250, which is more typical in comparative cities. The lack of enforcement encourages long-term parking, as we've seen both in the study and in the update. And Carrboro is one of only a few that do not charge for parking in this region. And also paid parking can help fund parking management and discourage single occupancy vehicle usage. And the chart there kind of, if you recall, goes over and looks at a little bit specifically about the number of various jurisdictions that have paid on-street or paid off-street parking, just as a summary as well as some time limits. So Carrboro is really the only one that has very little, with the exception, of course, of Salisbury, that has no paid off-street or on-street parking. And the triangle, as you may recall, is really kind of a balance between proximity and the price of parking, how proximate it is to the businesses or the destination, and the availability. And really, that's kind of the three triangles that we have to balance to figure out how best to approach parking. So the key recommendations that came out of the initial study were that we do some dedicated downtown parking enforcement, that paid parking should be seriously considered as an option for the town, that we need to enhance our public parking communications, that parking advisory committee be created, that we develop a uniform parking and wayfinding signage program, that we continue to do the public-private shared parking agreements as we have done in the past, and that we create a parking auxiliary fund. So, fast forward to November of 2022, we did some parking counts to give you a better idea of where we are within a year from the initial parking counts that were done by the study. So I do want to highlight some differences because there are some significant differences between what the parking study had, consultants did, and what we did. We did this in-house. We combined on-the-ground counts as well as drone footage. So I want to throw out a huge thank you to our IT department. They put in some hours and really dedicated the time to fly our drone around and get those photos for me at 4 different times from 9 in the morning till 9 at night. So I really appreciate their help with that. Another unique thing is that the counts that we looked at only included the off-street public parking. So we did not include private parking. We were really just looking at the town's public lots that were off-street as opposed to on-street. As you may know, we don't have a lot of on-street parking to begin with. There was also a 6-week difference between when the counts were originally done in the initial study in September versus when we did them in November. So there's going to be a little bit of a difference in weather patterns that may affect some of the counts. And this counts also include the new leases that we've acquired. So the Fitch Lot Lumber leases, as well as the Community Works leases that have been acquired since the study was completed. So here is the latest data from that count. You can see the occupancy rates at different times at 9 a.m., 11, 4, and 9 p.m. And the corresponding lot that it is referencing. We really want to look at anything over 80% as kind of a 80% occupancy as really kind of a flashing warning for us that we need to be looking at alternative options or finding additional parking nearby. That lot would be considered pretty close to capacity at that point. And that's when, if you remember what the original consultant said, that's when people start driving around trying to find parking when we're at above 80% occupancy. So we've highlighted some of the areas here. As you can see, we are in the red at a few of the lots. Weaver Street, of course, is really busy on a weekday morning. And the Roberson Acme lot, they're behind Acme and Orange County Social. Really high occupancies, again, really in that late morning, mid-afternoon period. And you can see that also the yellow area there for Robertson and Main Street lot right there at the corner. On Saturdays, of course, we see our highest occupancies here at Town Hall and the Laurel Avenue lot just down the street here, of course, due to the farmers market. But we're also seeing some peaking out pretty close to around 9 o'clock on a Saturday at the East Main Street deck, 300 East Main deck. So just some things to keep in mind, really kind of that late afternoon Saturday, we are starting to see those numbers start to creep up a little bit. But definitely around Town Hall and the farmers market. Saturday is pretty kind of consistent across the board. So another thing to note is that we lease quite a good number of these lots, and that our lease terminates at 90 days. So within a 90 days notice, we could be, the lots could terminate. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that the number of available spaces could go away if the lot owner decided that they wanted to pursue other options and develop the lot at any point. So looking at some of the levels of service, we tried to replicate the same process that Walker used with our data to try to give you a better, so what does this actually mean when we're looking at these numbers? And Walker used an 800-foot radius around various points of town, and we saw that in the study. And so we tried to replicate that to give us a really kind of an applicable feel for where we have high demand. And you can see all of our zones are in the green, but Zone 3 really stands out for a weekday on that Thursday count. That kind of that late morning, all afternoon period, really there in the central part of downtown around Main and Greensboro and Weaver and Greensboro are really kind of the big standout points. When we look at the Saturday, we also see one of the four stand out, and that's, of course, the Zone 1 there at Town Hall, and that's primarily, of course, driven by the farmers market. All morning at the 9 o'clock and the 11 o'clock count, we're showing pretty high numbers. And then Zone 4 also seems to be kind of the nightlife area of downtown. So that 80% coming in on Zone 4. Generally, it's still, we would consider that green. The average there wasn't quite high enough to bump it into a yellow category, but something definitely to keep in mind on that end of town. So the other thing we looked at is length of time. This was looked at in the study as well, and I know it's of interest to us as we talk about which direction we want to go as far as making parking policy. And so we didn't have necessarily the staff and capacity to be able to track every car in every lot like they did in the study, but we did do a sampling. So we looked at 51 parking spots, and we tracked it on Thursday, all day Thursday, and all day Saturday. And we tracked 51 parking spots in 3 different lots to give us a variety. And on Thursday, we saw 48 cars circle through those 51 spots. And on Saturday, we saw 61 cars that utilized those 51 spots. And you can see the results above in the chart. We had 31% of our cars were parking on Thursday 2 hours or less, 49% were parking on Saturday 2 hours or less. So, of course, the big highlight here is that we've had 69% of our cars that parked more than 2 hours on a weekday, and more than 51%, around 51% that parked more than 2 hours on a weekday. And it's interesting to note that out of the 51 parking spots, you can see we have that higher kind of stagnant cars actually kind of camping out in a parking spot. Only 48 cars were able to get those 51 spaces. When we jumped to Saturday, we're able to increase the amount of cars that we can park in those 51 spaces just by almost a 20% decrease in or increase in compliance of the 2-hour time limit. So after we originally presented the concept to the original study to the council, they asked us to go back and take this to the advisory boards and get some comments back. And so we did that. And I've provided some general comments in short here, but you have the full list of comments that they have made in your packet. So the Economic Sustainability Commission, they recommended that they would like to serve as the parking committee as recommended in the study out of the key recommendations, and that they will provide specific technical recommendations to the council. The Transportation Advisory Board overall was generally supportive of the parking study recommendations. The Climate Action Task Force recommended that paid parking should be implemented, and that things that enhance the need for public transportation and van pools should be utilized and encouraged, and that money from the parking should go back into parking. Should not go back. I'm sorry, yeah, should not go back into parking. And that they recommended generally moving forward with the recommendations. The Racial Equity Commission discouraged paid parking for residents and encouraged that we research more public-private partnerships and that we create paid parking with revenue to be used towards, if we do go down that route, create the paid parking to be used for racial disparities. And we also included the Carrboro Business Alliance comments in your packet as well. And they generally support annual counts, wayfinding, that we move forward with paid parking and enforcement, and that we incentivize paid parking engagement and payment and a payment in lieu of system. So what's next? So generally tonight, we're going to be asking you to kind of look and help you narrow down some of these issues, these key recommendations. These were originally from the study, and you've got the comments from the advisory boards. We think that 3 of these, the enhancement of public parking communications, uniform wayfinding and parking wayfinding and signage, and that public-private shared parking agreements, we're already moving forward with. So we do have the wayfinding program in process. We have improved parking communications both on navigation apps as recommended in the study. We've added a parking map to our website, and we've been working with communications and engagement department to get social media blasts out. And we'll also be putting a parking map on our information centers. The public-private shared parking agreements, we're already doing that and continuing to do that as opportunities present themselves. So that's something I think that we feel confident in as well. So we feel like those are kind of 3 things that we can help narrow down the discussion for y'all tonight. So what are we asking? We're asking what, if any, of these recommendations are you interested in moving forward with? And as staff prepare and research different options or whatever direction you choose to move in, are there any specifics that we need to keep in mind as we prepare proposals and options to come back to you with? So with that, Brady, do you want to touch on municipal service districts, or do you want me to cover a couple? Okay, all right, sounds good.
Start here, and then we'll move to the service district.
Yep, sounds good.
Thanks very much, John. All right, I appreciate the narrowing down of what you've asked us to kind of focus on. That's really helpful. So council members, I think I agree with John, it would be useful for us to maybe start at least focusing on the recommendations and what, if any or all, we're interested in following up on, and maybe thinking a little bit about, priorities out of those 4 remaining recommendations that John has listed on the slide there. And then, of course, any other topics that you want to raise, noting that we'll also get some information, I guess, in a few minutes about these business improvement or municipal service districts. So who wants to share? Barbara?
So thank you, John, for the presentation and also for the pocket questions. I just wanted to mention briefly, going back to my email earlier, I really would appreciate this information with the agenda packets on Friday. It's just a lot easier to pull it together. I mean, the job that I work, I'm required to be at the bench working and not checking council email. So it makes it hard, I know, for me. So I would appreciate that in the future. The dedicated downtown parking enforcement, I did read about the recommendation for 1 FTE and then about a parking ambassador. And the parking ambassador, it looked interesting to me, but the parking ambassador, I believe they were saying could or could not write citations, more of a feel-good type employee, welcome to downtown and you can park over here. But meanwhile, if you're not parked where you should be parked, I can't write you tickets. So I was just trying to figure all that out. And the second question is a parking advisory committee. So I understand that the ESC group is very interested I guess, in being that group or being a part of that group, being that group? Okay, and so I think the recommendation mentioned having downtown business owners and other, I guess, downtown stakeholders. So how would all that kind of come together? I'm not against the ESC because I'm sure that there are probably some folks on the ESC that have downtown businesses. So that mix may already be there. So I'm not sure, I wasn't clear on that. But then also realizing that folks roll on, they roll off. So I was thinking about that as well. So the FTE, a little bit more clarity on that, because I would be interested in somebody who actually can do the enforcement. I mean, that would be, that would be the real thing. I like the idea of the ambassador, but I don't know. I just don't know how that would work. I did like what I saw, but like, as far as like enforcement, would they really be able to enforce anything?
Thanks, Barbara.
So that's initial. Yeah.
So
Thank
maybe
you.
those two questions from Barbara, if you could offer some answers before we move on.
Sure. So as far as the FTE, basically what they're just saying is that their recommendation is that we have at least one full-time equivalent parking enforcement person. So I think there's some opportunity here for us to kind of craft the position as we need. So I think we could have a parking ambassador that could have the ability of enforcement.
Okay.
So certainly, but we would just maybe say customer service first, or, put your ambassador front foot forward before we get to the enforcement part of it. So I think that's an opportunity for us to kind of craft the position to how we see it.
And I appreciate that. And I guess my concern about that is that we already know we have a lot of folks parking in our downtown and they leave their cars all day, go other places and whatnot. And so I understand about the warm and fuzzy, but, we also need somebody who's, going to do actual enforcement, to kind of deter that kind of behavior, because we know that is happening. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, sure.
I'm finished too.
Okay.
I think I think that it's kind of one of those things where it's like, your first offense will give you a warning, and that's where the ambassador shows through. But the second time, that's when we. As far as the recommendation of the advisory committee, we do have businesses that are represented on the Economic Sustainability Commission. And as a matter of fact, that's a requirement of the members, is that 3 of them have to be business owners in the community. So
We already got that mix going there.
there's already a good mix there, yeah.
That's cool.
Thank you, Barbara. And I totally agree with that first point about, to me, key is enforcing. Like, if the first step in managing the supply we have is to actually enforce what we have in place. But I also like the idea of it being kind of a warning first, then move on. But thanks for that, John. I have Randy next, and waiting for other hands to go
I
up.
actually just have a question before I get into other material. Can you go back to the advisory board recommendations? I didn't realize this till I saw it up there, but there's a big difference between what the Climate Action Task Force is saying and the Race Equity Commission on paid parking. And I'm just wondering, Council, if this is not a good opportunity. I mean, since those are the key pillars of our comprehensive plan, if the Climate Action Task Force and the Race Equity Commission should have a conversation, and I'd love to hear what the meeting of the minds suggests, because the comprehensive plan is based on promoting these 2 pillars, and the paid parking should be something that they can have a conversation and inform our thinking. And I'm just making that recommendation ahead of our conversation, because to me, if our comprehensive plan is predicated on those 2 pillars, and the 2 key advisory groups for those pillars have not had a conversation then we are not informed. And I would like, and I'm sorry I didn't realize this in the packet, but when I saw it up there, it just all of a sudden became real obvious to me that both those groups need to have a conversation together and together recommend to us. So that I would just hold that out for that reason.
While you have the floor, did you have other comments to share?
I'll wait because I think that that's something that informs how we go forward.
Susan, and then Danny.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I wanted to just touch on a few things that have already been said. I agreed very much with Barbara about the pocket questions were really helpful. I also really agreed with Barbara and Damon in terms of a parking enforcement, but also possibly somebody who can, enforcement is the key thing, but also somebody who maybe this is an opportunity to do a little bit in terms of tourism or in terms of helping folks with directions or a flat tire or that kind of thing. So it would be nice if some of those other things could be built in, but the number one priority, of course, is the enforcement. So the enforcement to me would be such a big thing in terms of addressing the turnover. And one of the slides showed that I think it's 50% of parkers are staying past the 2 hours. Also, I think one of the statistics was 20% of parkers, those who are parking, are staying for over 6 hours. So we're probably getting a little bit of this poaching, right, where folks from Chapel Hill are maybe coming to our parking spaces, parking for a day, and then going on to campus or what have you. So the enforcement, I think, would really help to get at that. So I would be very much in favor of that. I do think that there's a lot going on in Carrboro right now with the 203 project also, all the uncertainty about what that will do for parking. There's, to me, a question mark. I wasn't sure the 300 East Main deck. I didn't know if that was sunsetting soon. I wasn't sure the status of that, is the lease. So I'm, all of this is to say there's a lot going on with our parking. I would be very interested in first going full throttle on the enforcement and seeing what kind of impact that could have. And then looking a little bit, we'll have, maybe looking a year out, where are we, doing another count in a year and seeing to what extent the enforcement is helping address some of the turnover that we badly need. I would be very much in favor of having the parking be a part kind of housed within the ESC, both because of the business representation within the ESC, but also I think the ESC works pretty closely with the Tourism Development Authority. So those all seem to go kind of hand in hand. And then I did have a question on the parking auxiliary fund. I thought we already had like a parking enterprise fund. So I wasn't sure, did we necessarily need to create a new fund or just use what we have? I think our current fund is based on a transfer of the general fund monies, and so would this be just keep that same fund, but if we ever go toward the paid parking, we would just be putting those fees into that fund? I wasn't sure about all of that, but that was just a question.
Do you know the answer to that?
I think there could be one and the same. We
One
have a
and the
special revenue
same.
fund, yes.
Okay, I thought that would be the case. And then finally, just very briefly, because I know this topic had been scratched out, but I do have a question on the wayfinding. I find that that is such an important part of helping people navigate around town. I think their parking is there. In some cases, people are having a hard time finding it just because there's not enough signage. So, John, when you mentioned that the wayfinding was things were in progress, give us a little bit more of an update in terms of where things are, when you think all of the signage will be completed, how much signage do you expect to have? I'm also especially concerned about the signage all having sort of that universal, that same universal parking look, including a P that widely recognized P for parking. I'm curious if it's going to have that as well.
Yeah, so we got a refreshed quote, basically, updating it. We've kind of narrowed the scope a little bit just to keep a focus on downtown and make sure that we have the funding to be able to do that and get the signage that's needed for downtown. We're currently working with finance on allocating the funds and getting that taken care of. Looks like we might be using some ARPA funding possibly for that as well. So at this point, we're finalizing that, and we're anticipating that finance will be getting you a project ordinance here. It should be pretty shortly here. So, and then that'll give us the initial kickoff we need to go ahead and proceed with the purchase, and then we can get the installation completed.
Okay, and so the design is complete at this point, and will the signs have the P on them for parking?
I can't recall the specific design if it has the P on it or not, but it does say like Carrboro public parking. We've got the signage has specific lots that are have a specific look to them. We're using the wayfinding signage study that was done, I think, back in 2018, maybe. We're using that same design that was developed at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I apologize. I don't have I don't recall the look right off the top of my head, but
That's fine.
it is very uniform.
Great. And the signs will be in English and Spanish?
Yes.
Right. And one final question. A parking app. I know Chapel Hill uses Parkmobile, and I have not used it, but I understand people who have used it seem to really like it. So I'm curious if the possibility of our getting an app here in Carrboro, if that seems likely in the short term.
Yeah. So the Parkmobile app I think you're talking about is actually their paid parking system. So it's a map, but it tells you what lots are available and where you can pay for parking. Without some kind of system like that, it's hard for us to be able to tell what lots are available because we don't know what spots will be available.
So you really need the meters, if you will, in order to have the app.
Correct.
There's
Yeah.
not any other technology that could help you be.
There is, but it's fairly expensive. It would require us to put essentially sensors on every parking space.
Got you. Okay. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Susan, next is Danny and then Sammy.
Thanks, y'all. Susan, I really appreciate that. It's a perfect segue into my. Actually, I'll back up. I've appreciated several of the comments so far. I think Randy has a great idea to have a joint discussion between the boards. But I think it's important that if we do that, we leave here with like a pretty clear plan for them to evaluate, rather than, I think it's hard for advisory boards to notionally discuss this without clearer direction to bounce off of like what council intends. So to that end, I would like to focus us on a recommendation around paid parking, taking the Racial Equity Commission's concerns very top of mind. A couple thoughts about that. I think first, I think it's entirely possible that those comments could be allayed quite a bit with performance parking and time management considerations. If we're talking about 90 minutes to 2 hours free, my suspicion is we're not really talking about a great economic burden on very many people, especially for necessary tasks, especially when you consider how often, say, grocery shopping is private lots that exist in that stock and things like that. So I think we should be really clear to the Racial Equity Commission about which spots we mean for how long. And I would really like us to focus on, I hear that there's a lot of swirl and confusion around parking in Carrboro, and I would be pretty comfortable with taking the construction of the 203 project as sort of a runway period where we do focus strictly on enforcement. But already what we're running up in this discussion is like a lot of what we want to see is going to require revenue, and enforcement is, very much part of that. If we're going to do enforcement, we're going to need some money in order to just enforce. So I would not want us to forestall a concrete start to paid parking any longer than tonight. or at least a date by which we would like to do that. And again, I'm comfortable saying that it is upon the completion of the 203 project, even 6 weeks following, even to build in. And until that time, we're going to be focusing on enforcement. Maybe there's some money we can find in year one budget. But thereafter, I really do think we should be moving toward a performance parking model based around either, I think we should really consider being fairly aggressive about this. I think 90 minutes town-wide for free. I'm looking at these numbers. I'm not really sure that the 2-hour population, on the weekend, maybe it's 2 hours on the weekend. Maybe we have a different number on weekdays. We're not talking about a majority of people within that 2-hour window. I think treating that as sort of the benchmark for free parking may not be where we're optimizing equity and revenue and access. So I think, maybe it's 60 minutes places. I think, honestly, what's most important is getting the system in place, because as we learn and we're adaptive, as some citizens have written in and our staff has noted in the past, we can adjust this as it goes. If we have a lot slammed full during the peak hours, that can be our most expensive lot in town. If it turns out not to be, then we can have free spots there for as long as we need them. But all of that requires us to commit to paid parking. So that, and then I had a question about, and maybe this is bleeding into our part B, but the extent to which businesses could participate in performance parking. I'm sort of intrigued by the idea, given our private lots, that it may be that they can contribute to our pool for a percentage of the revenue. And so, say, for instance, I don't know, Danny's Pizzeria has 6 slots, and we put 4 of them up after close, 5 p.m. to 11, and maybe we keep, 20% of that? Or maybe all businesses who participate in this pool keep 20% of that, and the rest goes into, I think now we're thinking about a municipal service district, so I don't want to jump the gun. But is that possible, John, to disperse and share revenue within towns' performance parking with business owners in that way?
So my understanding of some of the technology, and I should caveat this by saying that anytime we're talking about doing something like this, it's going to depend on the available technology. So my understanding is there is technology out there that can allow us to do something like that, that the business owner would have maybe a portal or something that they would flip on and flip off their parking spots. I think that there are some challenges to that. When people are looking for parking, they're used to looking in particular locations. And so when you're one night this lot's available and the next night it's not, and then the next night it's not, and then maybe this night it is, I think that can get challenging for visitors and for our patrons that are visiting downtown. But I think that technology does exist, that something like that could be possible. As far as what the kind of revenue share model would look like, we would just have to look at what the cost of the technology would be and things like that. So it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, maybe it would not be crazy to think about it as sort of like a phase B, like after we implement public full paid parking, maybe in the sort of acquisition and implementation of that, we just want to look for systems that can be extended so we could troubleshoot that sort of independently afterward. That sounds sane to you?
Yeah, I just think that there's, it's definitely doable, and we can pursue something like that. I don't want to conflate the two. I just think that I would advise caution in doing so, because there could potentially be some concerns or conflation between where is it okay to park and where is it not okay to park. And the town will end up being in the middle of that, because if somebody now parks in this lot and they're not supposed to be there because I didn't flip the switch tonight, it's the PD who gets called, I get a call, it's the manager who gets a call, and people are parking in my lot and I'm open tonight. I just see more opportunities for conflict, I guess, potentially in that situation.
Yeah, totally understood. I guess it seems, that's perfectly reasonable. It also seems reasonable to assume that there may still be business owners who have more stable availability, and that we, like, if we're putting the system in place, we'll want to look for something that can do that for as much as we can. Just, I don't want to, I hear your point.
Yeah.
I think that's all I got. So to underscore, would love to hear from both boards, but like with a concrete proposal out of tonight, or with at least like some unity from council. Very much do want to establish a firm time frame for the implementation of paid. Interested in it being a performance model where we are able to optimize around traffic and demand. Interested in incentivizing private businesses through that system potentially as sort of a phase two. And that's, yeah, I think for this part A, I mean, I'm going to be very supportive of, I think, a municipal service district. And I think that that's a little bit related to this revenue question, but more to come there. So that's all for me.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Sammy, you're next.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks to all these comments so far. Just very quickly in regard to this caveat that John was bringing up, I think your point is good. I mean, the point is that businesses could participate if they are generally going to be offering their parking. We would not get into scenarios like you described, because they would be per town standards offering their parking in exchange for revenue share. So there are ways of skinning that cat. I don't know how proper that is nowadays. Whatever the equivalent PC is of saying that is what I meant to say. I also am all for, I mean, especially in light of the fact that our wayfinding we decided to do that 6 years. You know, if we decide to postpone moving forward with paid for parking, which by the way, it's already paid for, but I mean, people who are using the space paying for parking in real time, this won't happen until 15 years down the road. And I think the fact of the 203 coming online is an opportunity to do precisely what Danny was describing. The county is our partner in that, and they could be our guinea pig in testing out the business model. You know, we're offering this technology. Would you all like to revenue share with us with the majority of spaces of that building, which are the counties? I think the time is ripe. The danger is if we don't do it now, then we might be setting expectations where it'll be a harder thing to do later down the road. So, so I'm all for doing it in time for when the parking deck opens. So that's the timing aspect of that. In terms of this advisory committee, I would be more comfortable calling it a downtown access advisory committee. Also, I would like us to steer away from the idea that parking or access to the downtown is solely a business interest. We would want to include in such a committee representatives who are thinking in terms of climate, equity, businesses, obviously, and transportation. And I think that this advisory committee might be part of our second part of this conversation, because there's a way of having that kind of advisory board for a business improvement district. So it may fit into that a little more clearly and nicely. In terms of this apparent contrast between climate interest and equity interest, I think it's a great example of how we maybe shouldn't be thinking of these two things conflicting with each other, because there's an opportunity to not be thinking black or white or black, you know, climate, equity. What's really at hand here is capitalism and systems of destruction. Climate is, we're killing ourselves. The way we've treated our fellow people is killing them. Access to means for killing each other. In other words, being able to park like a little pig in front of the exact place where I want to go shop should be discouraged as something that is not something we want to be able to all have access to. So I think in the language, there's an opportunity here in changing our language and our assumptions of what it is that we want to have access to everyone. And so when we talk about this kind of technology, like the airport uses, it charges a lot more for if you want to park right there. But it's not that hard to park for free right down the road and catch the bus and save the planet. So I think that there's an opportunity to really be thinking about this, and I do look forward to that conversation between those two groups. But in the context of that conversation to inform us during our regular meeting when we'll be discussing the specifics about what a pay-for plan might look like. So it'd be kind of a staff would probably have to come up with what those specifics are so that those two groups could give us their input so that when we meet, we'll have the benefit of both staff and the two groups' conversations. Let's see, other than, I know I have 1,000 things that I'm interested in here, but I think most of them, definitely, parking enforcement must be included. That's a no-brainer. And all these things, represent costs. And I agree with the climate committee that we should be thinking of the revenue generated, obviously to pay for the technology itself, the maintenance of it, the parking, but be thinking more broadly in terms of this isn't for paying for parking, but rather access to our downtown more generally.
Thanks, Sammy. Since there aren't hands up now, maybe we want to learn about business. At least are now. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, there's not much I would add. The only thing I do want to say is that as we look forward, or as we bring this person on, definitely want to have this person to have enforcement abilities, focusing on folks who are spending kind of this 4 to 6 hour. I'm not super. One of the things I love about Carrboro is I can go and park anywhere and not have to worry about checking in on a meter or doing all this additional stuff that I find annoying when I go to like Raleigh or whatever. So I just want to make sure that as we bring someone on board, they are able to enforce, but focusing that on the folks who are staying there the whole day, because that is that's keeping folks from being able to access downtown. So aside from that, I do wanted to clarify. So we're talking about not having this additional fund, right? Because we already can use the ones that we have. Okay. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Eleazar. Randy, go for it.
Yeah, so a couple of other thoughts to weigh in on. I think it became evident that the 4 to 6 hours is important. I think it's important to people, residents in Carrboro, to not only be able to, do their shopping, but also hang out at Weaver Street. So I'd be very comfortable, number one, with monitoring and enforcement starting. I'd love to see it start tomorrow. And to support that in however we think that position can best not only do citations, which is what we really need the data on, but also to be the kind of person who can, have enough information to encourage people to, walk here, walk there, and say, did you know that this is here and this is there? I mean, and that takes really knowing the streets of downtown. I would be very supportive of a 3-hour window of time for residents. I think residents need to get like a rear view mirror hanger so that when the enforcement folks come around, they can distinguish who lives in Carrboro, who doesn't live in Carrboro, because if and when we get to paid parking, and I say if because I think we need a pilot. I think the perfect pilot is the Rosemary Street. I think that came out in this study that Rosemary Street is ready to go because half of it is Chapel Hill that already. So why don't we use that to inform our thinking, see how that goes, and during the time that we're learning about the enforcement piece, we can make certain decisions about paid parking, who pays, when they pay. And I say this because I think Damon and I were having a conversation. We were looking at that approximate 21% of folks who are parking over 6 hours. If that's strictly enforced, I would like to see the results of the data on if that 21% is extracted, what does the parking landscape look like in terms of what's available? I'd just like us to be very purposeful and intentional about the data that we need because, there's 22,000 people in Carrboro And I don't know off the top of my head what percentage live outside the 2-mile radius that will be driving, whether they're driving an EV vehicle in the future or biking with an EV bike. But they need to be able to get into Carrboro. This is their town. And I want to be very mindful of not only their need, but the needs of folks who are differently abled and, just cannot necessarily have access to public transit. Public transit does not go into the quote-unquote suburban neighborhoods, nor will it ever. And so why are we creating a situation where there's folks who will always have to be driving? So I just want us to be thoughtful. I want us to have the data to back it up. And I like the idea of the breathability that as we learn, we can move forward into these plans with more, more veracity because we have that information. I think it all needs to be on the table, but I do think Rosemary Street would be, that lot would be a great place to pilot the paid for parking and starting that enforcement. But I do want us to have more of a conversation about what we think could potentially happen with if that 20% or 21% were pulled out, and what would that look like if does enforcement work, and what does it look like if that 21% were extracted? Thanks.
Thanks, Randy. So I just want to kind of summarize a little bit about where we're finding, I think, a lot of common ground here and common interest. There's a lot of interest in starting enforcement. That seems like key to everything we want to do here. And I think gets us down the road toward the next step, which is a paid parking system, what that system looks like, how it can be operated. I really take to heart Randy's and Eleazar made this point as well about focusing first. Maybe if we need a place to start focus on those long-term parkers, people who are parking in lots from the whole day, right? What does that get us in this interim period where we're thinking about kind of a run, as Danny said, a runway to the 203 being finished. So I think that does seem like a priority to me as well. If we're looking to prioritize who we enforce the parking on, to start out with, is getting at the parkers who are there for 6+ hours, which is on weekdays 19, 20 or more percent. That's significant. That's a capacity. Opening up that capacity could have a huge impact alone. I also like this idea, though, of then thinking farther ahead about what does the paid system look like, and not just waiting to design that. Start designing that today, so that when we're ready to start it, for example, when the 203 comes online or whatever, we know what the system's going to look like. We've already approved the structure of it, how the revenue might be shared if we explore some of these private public models and so on. We've done all the planning work. We've built the system. We know what it looks like, so that when it's time to do it, we can just say, we vote yes. So I appreciate all those ideas as well. Now, whether that includes a pilot at Rosemary Street, sure, why not? They're already charging on the Chapel Hill side of that parking lot. It seems like a natural extension of what's already happening in the rest of that parking lot.
The data is already available.
We have the data. It's bizarre that it's split in the first place, right? Yeah, it's not a ton of spaces. Yeah, I don't think.
18 maybe.
But yeah, I really, it sounds like we're kind of on the same page here about how to proceed. There's interest in exploring all of the remaining recommendations, starting primarily with enforcement. Getting an enforcement regime is the right word. But starting on enforcement, sounds like there's an interest in sort of starting with soft enforcement. In other words, you begin with a warning, as you said, John, but then beyond that, it's time to in the citations. So whoever this employee is will need to have the power to do citations, but also an interest in that person being more than just, an enforcement agent, right? But actually being a resource for the community to offer folks information and directions, and being kind of a good guy. But then moving on to the paid system, if we just start designing that now, and maybe staff comes back to us with some ideas of what that looks like, so that we can say yes, and when it's time to do it, we do it. Maybe we even at that time decide when that's going to be. I don't know, but let's at least have the proposal in front of us to make a decision about it. What is the other? Parking Advisory Committee. Okay, so the recommendation in the study was to use the ESC as the base for that. That seems like a simple, straightforward way to go. I think crucially getting to one of Sammy's points, which I think is really important. ESC has business owner representation, but also other members who are not necessarily business owners. So maybe I think that'll be on us as the people who appoint the members to that commission to be thinking about, well, this new role for the ESC, let's be thinking about who's being appointed to that commission. We want business owners, and we must have business owners there, but we also need other folks who bring a different perspective to that conversation. So I'm personally comfortable with using ESC as the home for parking, the Parking Advisory Committee or the Downtown Access Committee or whatever we want to call it. And then finally, sounds like we have a fund structure and we have an enterprise fund in place. We don't really need to change that for now. If there are, I would like to hear more in the future about these private-public opportunities. In other words, so Danny talked about private participation in the public pool. Is that a realistic model for us to pursue? What would it cost us? You know, is there an additional technology requirement there? And then on the same theme, I'd like to learn more. I know this was not a focus of today's presentation, John, but learn more about these opportunities for private partnerships. We have a lot of parking in town that's privately held. This has been a long-term recommendation of this council that be taken advantage of in terms of fostering relationships between property owners, but it hasn't always been super successful. But I think if we're going to have private property owners, private business owners continuing to come to us saying we're having a parking crisis or a parking problem, yet we have a lot of private property owners sitting on capacity, we need them at the table helping us to figure that out. It can't just be all on the public lots when there's plenty of capacity there that can be shared or purchased from each other or whatever model makes sense for private property owners. But I think it can't just be us figuring out that problem for private property owners. Did I cover what I needed to cover there before we move on to learning more about these service districts? Okay, so I had Susan and then Barbara and then Randy.
Thank you. I think you covered everything, and I had just four other additions. In terms of the ESC, I just wanted to mention I serve as the council liaison to the ESC, and I think that the ESC really understands that parking is one component of access, and also I think the ESC members were very interested in soliciting feedback from the other advisory boards. And I think they would be very interested in renaming themselves an access group. So I appreciate those comments. In terms of the, another thing that would be really helpful for me as we're gathering this information would be, in the parking study, I don't think there were revenue projections based on giving people discounts or not charging for the first hour or 2 hours or not charging Carrboro residents during that time period. And it would be really helpful for me to see just how much revenue ends up getting lost by not making, having those kinds of numbers as we go to make decisions on whether or not to impose a parking fee. That would be really helpful. Looking at different fees as well as different amounts of time that won't be charged. Does that make sense, John? Mm-hmm. The other thing we haven't talked about was town employees parking in the 203. From your
county employees.
And county employees as well. And Mr. Manager, from the email today, it looked like there are, wrote that down, 110 county and 61 town. We have control over ourselves. I'm in the camp that won't be very popular with staff, but I'm in the camp that would favor not having town employees park at the 203 and also be using this time to look for satellite parking. Sounds like there may be some satellite parking at Jones Ferry was a possibility I heard someone mention, but I would like to learn a little bit more about satellite parking opportunities. And then finally, this is This came up in the study, and I just wanted to highlight it, that we needed to change our town code to clarify that a permit or license plate was required in order for people to take advantage of the handicap parking. And then if folks are parking in spaces that are specifically for handicap, that would be another thing that needs to be enforced. I noticed our fee was $50. Other places are $200, $250. You know, I don't understand. You know, I would be in favor of just being consistent with what others are doing, because if somebody is repeatedly doing that, it's a pretty serious offense for me in terms of making that space inaccessible to somebody who really needs it. So, anyway, just wanted to throw that out.
So these 4 additional points that are really requests for information from staff when they come back with a proposal for us. Is everybody on board with those? Okay, so it was basically, well, really, it was ESC's interest in doing this and providing and getting feedback from the other advisory boards, and it being called a Downtown Access Committee. 2, revenue projections, as well as opportunity costs for different strategies, parking for employees, public employees, and changes to the town code to deal with handicap spaces.
The increase ticket.
If that's needed in the, whatever proposal staff wants to bring us on that, yeah. Okay, I had next Barbara, and then I have Randy.
So just following up on what Susan just said, I think she looked over here and saw what I had highlighted, but I'm going to let her go. I'm just joking. And so all of our parking policies that I see here, I guess I would just kind of say that we would need to review those that we currently have in the town code, which is what Susan just mentioned about the ADA parking, as well as a 2-hour parking policy. I love Sammy's idea about the good mix on the Downtown Access Committee. That sounds better to me than the Parking Advisory Committee. You know, it has a it has a broader scope, and certainly I would hope that we could find there, for some other community folks to sit on that committee. John, could you go back to the slide that had the advisory board recommendations real quick? Yes. So the Climate Action Task Force Racial Equity Commission, so CAT says money from parking should not go back into parking. And then the Racial Equity Commission says pay parking with revenue to be used towards racial disparities. So I'm also hearing we have a parking enterprise fund. And I also saw in the material that we want ideally this to be a self-funded project. So I'm just thinking about how that would work, because how much money is in the parking enterprise fund? Oh, is there anybody?
About 300.
Oh, it's just a minimal amount.
It's a transfer from the general fund.
Oh, got it. So it's not a lot of seed money in there to do too much of anything. So I was just thinking about that, it being self-funding with that 1 FTE, and then the maintenance of any parking technology that we have, and just how all that would work, especially if the revenue from parking is not going back into a fund. I'm just thinking, and I'm not against that either, but just thinking about how we would finance that.
The revenue to pay for the programs, for the parking program.
That's what I was thinking.
Cost that we incur for running the program.
Right.
But then any kind of additional, we'd want to make sure goes into better uses.
Yeah, so we would have to, I guess, figure that out. And then the last thing is, I know we've been talking about wayfinding for a while, and there was actually something on the table for a while. So are we just kind of starting over with the wayfinding? Are we using a new, and that predates you and probably you as well?
I've seen designs since I've been here. There's an actual whole package of wayfinding signage.
Right, and it looked pretty good from what I recall. So I was just trying to figure out, are we going back and using the same consultant? Or are we starting over? And I heard you mention something about funding through ARPA.
Yeah, we are using the same consultant as we did previously. So we just asked them to update the cost analysis We narrowed the scope a little bit, kind of to at least with the phase one, to really focus on downtown, and then ask them to update that so that we have new numbers, since the original was from, I think, 2018.
Okay, and that sounds good. And I think somebody else might have mentioned, but that wayfinding to me is just a really low hanging fruit and just a critical piece, of the whole puzzle, to help folks get around town. And there shouldn't be any problem with our web communications, like creating a web page around parking or downtown access. As Sammy was saying, I do like the downtown access piece though, but I don't know. So I guess there's no problem with getting that website created and all that. That would be like low hanging fruit as well, right?
Yeah, we've actually already got the website created or web page created for that.
Okay.
For parking, and we actually incorporated the bus lines that go through downtown as well on that map. So
Okay.
it makes it easy for folks to park in one spot and take the bus to another.
I feel like I think that was it. And then Randy mentioned about the residents with the hanger in the car. And the time limit enforcement, which I think that's a critical piece too, of the enforcement, like just how long, for folks, before we would actually start charging a fee for them to park or have access downtown. So, yeah, so it's a lot to think about. It's a lot of moving parts. Thanks.
So we've got, so Barbara had this, it's a good idea to make sure there are other provisions of the town code that may need to be updated if we're going to be going after some of these issues around time limits and handicap accessibility and so on. Downtown Access Committee. It's just maybe some proposals as part of what you bring back, John, around the use of parking revenues. How would we use parking revenues, given the recommendations we have from more than one advisory board making that point? And then the residential hangar thing. I mean, I guess my feeling about the residential parking decal or whatever is like, if just make it free for a certain period of time for everybody. And then after that, I mean, it seems like that's an administrative layer that feels complicated to me, rather than instead just like make it free for everybody for 2-3 hour, whatever the time limit is. And then beyond that point, you start charging. You know what I mean? But anyway, you're next on the list, Randy, so go ahead.
Yeah, and so, and I think that's going to unfold as we learn more about enforcement, because one of the things that I'm hoping enforcement will teach us, based on the data we have, is that the time frame that we expect to capture that 21% is Monday to Friday, or probably even more possible Monday to Thursday. So the parking enforcement, that's going to be the key time for the enforcement and for us to collect that data. The reason why I recommend the residential hangar is that once we have that information, we may want to be able to be more specific to see if the Carrboro residents are staying longer. I'm just saying it's another way of collecting data.
Oh, I see, using the citation data.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So just something to keep in the mix as a possibility.
And that's what I was going to ask to clarify, because I think that's that's key. And then I think the question of, how do we want to address weekend use is going to depend on whether that 21% gets extracted actually, because that's when the destination Carrboro downtown is going to shift. I just put that out there because I think that's something that, over time, whoever's doing the enforcement, will be able to help us think that through.
Any more comments on this topic before we move on?
Yeah. I think the technology is going to be key in terms of like being able to, like Danny was pointing out, experiment and see what works for Carrboro. And this idea of 2-hour free parking, the other way of thinking of it is 2-hour free in lots. You showed a lot of lots that are empty all the time. So 2-hour free in all those lots. And then the ones that are most used, those cost more because they're very much in high demand. And again, the technology will allow us to implement that. So when that comes to us, I'm interested in not just the 2-hour for free all over, but also the other option of how can we maximize use of all our lots, and hopefully with participation of private lot owners too. In terms of the 203 parking, Susan, thanks for bringing up the employee parking. I think the other opportunity, Mr. Manager, is when you're having that conversation with the county, is to check in with them to what degree and encourage them as a council. I think has this interest that they also participate in having their employees park elsewhere, not, like we're hopefully modeling for them, and not just modeling for the county, but modeling to all employees and business owners in our town. Like hopefully we'll be able to, in the next item, talk about how to pay for satellite parking so that we can even make more surplus than the surplus we already have in parking in our downtown. And then in terms of, I'm grateful for this parking update in terms of counts, but I think that every 4 years, so every 2 years, maybe just public lots, but it's very important to keep a tab on town-wide lots, and maybe that's contracting out, maybe it isn't a staff thing to do, because as we're tinkering and implementing and enforcing, and there'll be opportunities to see how this has an effect on all our parking stock, private and public, private being the most. So especially important to understand what's going on there. And that's it.
I think those are all good additions. Great. So y'all, it's about 10 after 8, and we want to hear about the municipal service districts and talk a little bit about what that means and how it works and so on. We got some good information in the packet for today, but Brady and or John, it's back to you.
I can just lead it off. So there's a statute within 168, it's Article 23. It's the Municipal Service District Act. And essentially it gives municipalities and counties in 153A the authority to be able to create and define certain areas within the municipality. And with that, you're able to go and levy additional property taxes on top of the already municipal tax rate, and then use those proceeds or generate revenue in order to fund certain project services or facilities within that district. Municipalities have pretty broad authority to do so, so long as for the purposes listed in that statute, and one of which is relevant to this discussion is off-street parking or off-street parking facilities. There is a cap on how much tax you can actually go and levy in these districts, so I'm happy to get a little bit into that. And then there's a whole procedural process, obviously, in terms of first defining these districts, giving the opportunity for the public to be able to review those, and of course, public hearing notices and certain procedures. And ultimately, this would be done by ordinance through you all. So it wouldn't require necessarily a referendum by the public.
Thanks for that overview, Brady. So maybe start first with questions, just for clarification and information. Sammy, go ahead.
Thanks, Brady, for that information. I think that this is a great model, especially as we're talking about how to make parking not a requirement in our downtown, and business owners have been requesting that the town have more of a participation in providing parking, to make sure that private lot owners, businesses continue to have participation in terms of cost of providing downtown parking, as we've been very successful with our presumptive standards in having private lot owners, private businesses provide parking. We don't lose their participation in what's represented by the cost of land, for example. And so one way to maintain their continued participation is through such a district as the one you've described. And we're talking about all these costs too, as we're talking about enforcement and this parking program and leasing lots. And we just now are paying $3 million for the 203 portion that the town is responsible for parking. which represents $150,000 per year. Our revenue, our parking fund is 300, Mr. Manager, I believe you said. So that's right there, 450. And this kind of district can pay for a lot of things relating to access to the downtown, including wayfinding, parking enforcement, parking ambassadors, parking payment infrastructure and management, Chapel Transit portion for Carrboro, scooter bike share program, parking, mobility charging infrastructure, satellite parking. So all these are things that can be paid for to the extent that they are serving the core of this district. So, and then there's two models, Brady, correct me if I'm wrong here. There's one where this can be subcontracted out to another entity. I believe Chapel Hill and Durham do that model, where the town doesn't have as much participation. But the other model is the town itself provides these services directly, makes use of those funds and provides services directly. In which case, the council is itself the body that's making those decisions. We could set up an advisory board, or maybe it could be the ESC that would take that role of helping us think these complexities out for how to use those funds. Me personally, I would be interested in the second model where the town is participating in it, because I very much believe it's of the interest of us as a town, the viability of our downtown, and that we be accountable to the public at large for this kind of district, and that we represent all the issues that are involved with a downtown. Like I mentioned before, it's not just making sure that businesses are viable, but there's climate, there's equity, there's transportation issues. And Brady, from what I understand, is that the key, and when we set up this program, if we were to do so, is defining what those costs could be used for and what the purpose of the fund is specifically. And one general way of maybe describing what this fund is to maximize emancipation from car and fossil fuel dependency while keeping access to the downtown by people to no less than current levels of access. And I think that would address kind of all the interests that we have here. We want to maintain the well-being of our businesses in the downtown, but we also want to address issues of access to the downtown and of environment. And that might be one way to define how to do that. So I'm interested in us having a regular meeting where staff brings to us some models for how we could set this up, including some of the costs that it could be used for, and some of the general definitions of how we define the fund, and then and of course have the advisory boards participate and give us input in that process.
Thanks, Sammy. I'm really interested in this model and learning more about it, and even to the point of similar to what I suggested earlier about we know down the road the paid parking is coming, right? So we should set ourselves up to do that, have the structure in place, an understanding of how it will work, what costs will be associated with it. It seems like an opportunity to go ahead and design a district like this, to just have the structure in place so that if we decide the time comes, we're ready to enact it. I do have a couple of questions about some of the details. Coming from a place of almost total ignorance about it, borrowing what you've shared by email, Brady, and the materials you shared in the agenda packet. I think about some of the experiences of our downtown property owners, and one of the issues that's come up between property owners is that some of our downtown property owners have tons of parking, and they're meeting, for example, our ordinance requirements, for presumptive minimums and so on, for a lot of historical reasons, right? And for equally reasonable historical reasons, right? A lot of our downtown properties have like almost no parking and no land on which they could provide parking. So they're relying on public, or they're sharing parking with their private neighbors or whatever. I'd just be interested in learning more about how you design a downtown zone or district given that disparity that exists today on the ground, right? And how do we make sure we're being fair in that? So just as you think about how to design something. how do we deal with that problem or that challenge?
And that's like the nutshell of the standard that they go and provide is they need this area needs this service more than the other areas within the municipality, right?
But is it to,
Demonstrably greater extent, I think, is the General Assembly language.
is it the kind of thing that can be sort of tweaked in the sense? I mean, you're creating one district, and so every property within that district presumably is having the additional property tax levied. You're not differentiating between properties based on how much parking they already contribute to the supply, that kind of thing. It's not, you can't really do that. It's the district that is the district, and every property within the district is affected. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? And then there's ways that you can go and add to and subtract. I mean, that's all set forth through the statute. Actually, ways where, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, where property owners can actually petition to say, I don't want to be part of this district. And there's just a procedure for them to go and do that, to have due process.
Presumably, though, then they're also not reaping the benefits of having that.
I think that's
the idea, right? Okay. So so I have Barbara coming next, and so if people have additional questions for Brady about how this works, and also just be interested in having a kind of a simple thumbs up or thumbs down in terms of like, are people interested in at least having a proposal come back from staff? So Barbara, go ahead.
Yes, I am. And so it's to piggyback off what you were just saying, Mayor, and also you, Brady. So the BID tax rate must be uniform throughout a BID. But if differential rates are desired for different parts of the downtown, different BIDs must be established. So we actually could have more than one BID. Is that correct? I mean, unless I'm not like.
Here's my only
There's some hesitation.
don't want to have, yeah. I think bottom line is I don't think you want to go, let's say you did this just for the downtown parking for one area, right? You want to charge everybody the same addition.
Right.
Because what the Constitution basically says is you don't want to go and charge some people one tax and other people another. I think maybe and that's UNC School of Government, and I believe John found those, but I found a whole bunch of other stuff on the UNC, and I think that might be getting to maybe different types of projects and different kind of BIDs, but I wasn't trying to get too much in the weeds of that just because I thought we were gearing more towards the off-street parking, which is a different section in the statute. But I can certainly look more into what.
No, because if you say no, I'm gonna just scratch it right here. I mean, because my preference would be just to have something uniform, so there wouldn't be any.
That would be our
You
recommendation.
guys were talking about. I was like, but it says right here, if differential rates are desired for different parts of downtown, that was a thing. But since you said no, then no. So I'm finished. Thank you.
Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, Brady, I wanted to ask about, because I didn't catch it, about the opting out. Well, how does that work? And
Look up. I think they petition.
who do they petition?
You all. Yeah, to council.
And is that based on any particular constraints, like the size of the footprint of their bricks and mortar?
If you give me just one, here we go.
Basically say that if they have to prove that they no longer need the services, is basically what, or they don't need the
You
services.
said prove.
They have to make a proof to, like, have a statement that says that they no longer need these services.
Yeah, John's exactly right. It says reasons why the tract or parcel is not in need of the services, facilities, or functions.
And it's specific, the services are specific to parking.
Well, that have been defined in the ordinance.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I'm using that as sort of the primary example.
Okay.
There's a lot of other stuff that you can go and create municipal service districts for besides that.
Right, but we're putting this in the context of the parking. Okay, I just wanted to be clear with
I think that actually I think this statute or this whole section came in like maybe 2011, and the legislature has amended it a few times, and I think that was the most recently amended, like maybe in 2016 or something.
Yeah,
You give the
because-
property owners an opportunity to say, hey, well, I'm already in the outskirts of this district, I shouldn't be included for X, Y, and Z reasons.
But let's say we were looking at the slide that had that central
Right.
Carrboro district. There's a lot of cubbyhole businesses that are very tiny that additional property tax, could knock them off the
Sure.
chessboard.
Yeah.
I would not want to put any of our small business owners, I mean, Carrboro doesn't have any major corporations, so to speak. It's mostly, small businesses. So I would want us to be well-informed and have ample input by our business owners. Here's the only, and let me just put this in the long view, and John has heard me say this. Back in, 2000, Board of Aldermen came up with a, Vision 2020. And one of the things that it had hoped to do was to increase the tax base, the commercial tax base by 50%. No, that's not going to happen. But one of the things that has been consistent in the pattern of businesses in Carrboro, and it's probably the only thing I can say is consistent, is that there seems to be 5 to 8 year stability and then a shift. Okay, we definitely saw a big shift in 2008, 2009. The pandemic was another shift. But we know that businesses will consistently in Carrboro shift because they, if they get to be a certain size, they need more space, or for whatever reason. So my question really is, if a business locks in, right, at a certain property tax rate, then that's going to keep escalating with each owner that comes in.
Yeah, so long as the district's established. Yeah, and there's also, and I remember, again, the UNC School of Government kind of spoke to this in an article, too, I wrote that, let's say you go and establish the additional tax, and it's usually should start at the fiscal year, right? Well, it's nothing to say that you do that for a year, but the next year you decide to not levy that tax. The district still stays, right? And then you could hold off for another year and then say, okay, well, we're going to go and charge a tax again. Does that sort of make sense? So it gives some flexibility so long as it's consistent and within that year.
Thank you.
Danny, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor. I would very much love to see a proposal for this district. And I think, one of the things that will really make this successful is on staff helping us to benchmark the sort of value and what success looks like for this. Because I think one way to think about this, both to Randy and Sammy's point, is, I don't think it's necessarily the highest or only good here, but, I think one of the biggest goods here is the potential to drive revenue for businesses. The idea is right now we have businesses fighting over relatively scarce traffic, and this is effectively a buyer's pool for traffic. And so I think one of the things that we want to understand, John and staff, would really help us is, and I would love to see this, let me try not to mess up operations. I would just love to know I guess really as concrete a sense as we can of the benefits of these districts as opposed to what the cost looks like. And I would love to know it in terms of what revenue drivers typically are for different types of downtown accessors. And the reason I'm saying it a little bit mangled is because what I have in mind is, we are also asking staff to come back with text amendments to our LUO to increase zoning in a lot of districts that would really be material to this kind of downtown access. If we are improving the ability for people to live in transit accessible corridors, we're talking about a pretty radical increase, potentially, in the kind of consumer and business presence that would, it's entirely likely that we could be changing the calculus a great deal if, if we do what we have said on the council, what we mean to from density and zoning. And so that's where, I start to wonder, how much more is someone who comes on foot per hour worth to a business? How much more is a resident within X distance worth to a business, as opposed to, somebody who is driving in. And, those are sort of abstract and granular. But I think, the idea is that, a change to the urban form, which is supplemented or buttressed or working in tandem with the business improvement district is ultimately, a real force multiplier for businesses, where they're paying into services which are really driving their bottom line quite a bit higher, is certainly my goal. And I think, we're not going to get where we want to go on climate. I don't know if that always needs to be the North Star, but certainly I think that like the success of this model depends on its success for the people currently in the model. And so as we look at this, I would really like a dollars and cents understanding of what benefits, I think there are other places where this has happened. I think I've seen some numbers on, I don't want to talk too dumb. But I've seen comparable figures from towns that have pursued comparable things. And I would be really curious about the revenue and I would also be curious in the context of the potential for the zoning changes that we're talking about. I don't want us to just be thinking about Carrboro as it exists today, but if we are talking about somewhere where it is much more feasible for transit connected and pedestrian people to be like primary revenue drivers in our downtown, what does that mean for our local businesses? How does that change the possible expenses for a business? And that's really where we get into, like, do we need to revisit the Chapel Hill Transit Agreement in light of, our tax base is starting to really show dramatic growth with people who will be accessing the transit, like Carrboro could be a much more viable partner within that system in theory. So I'll say, I don't know if this is clear, but I don't know if I'll make it clearer if I keep talking.
Yeah, stop right there.
So I think there is an interest in understanding what such a district would produce in terms of revenue. And I think conceptually, it's hard to ask staff to do this and, thinking, because we haven't actually talked in any specificity about these sort of other approaches in the comp plan around increasing density and so on. So, but conceptually, what does it mean to, maybe the best approach would be, can we see some examples of other communities that have done a similar kind of thing? And how have they paired in a business improvement district like this one or service district with other strategies to improve access and viability of their downtowns? I just want to point out, and I will call on you, that we're now past 8:30, and I think we've given staff a lot to work on. And we,
John, do you have? Oh, he doesn't have it.
These
but
are
we
just
do have a
summary
whole
on
other
the-
topic to get to. Yeah, so I just want to, so I'll call on Susan next. And
Thank you, and I will be brief. So just a few things. I appreciate your comments, and you were very clear. John, in terms of these case studies, first of all, I wanted to say, yes, I too would very much support seeing a proposal. In terms of the case studies, I would be interested in seeing case studies for towns comparable to the size of Carrboro, as opposed to larger cities, to Randy's point, that have big corporations, what have you. I did want to mention, when I think of Carrboro, we're small, independently owned businesses. Things are very, very fragile. And I think a small business owner hearing the word tax is immediately going to be very, very concerned. And so I would also suggest, as a first step, reaching out to some of our small business owners, getting their overall their pulse on this, but also their being aware of how this could actually really benefit them down the road, as opposed to being too focused on this on the tax. So those are my comments.
thank you, Susan. And I think given that our conversation, I'm sure we're sure we'll hear more about this from our ESC and from the chamber. I certainly hope so. And I guess I would, we've talked about there is it seems like an interest in going ahead and with this proposal of having a downtown access task or committee that's within the ESC, part of the ESC's charge. That's a great place to be generating this feedback about a proposal like this and whether to go forward with it. So anyway, just throw that in there as well. Okay, so we've given you some stuff to work on. Mr. Manager, anything else you need from us on this topic this evening?
No, that covers everything.
Are we good? Everybody else? All right. Great. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brady. I will say, I appreciate, Barbara, you pointing out that we do have folks listening in tonight from the CBA and from the ESC, and I really appreciate the feedback that y'all have offered so far and that you will hopefully continue to share with us. All right, speaking of advisory boards, we're going to talk about advisory boards. So I just will, again, I'll say it's 8:35. I don't know how much time you all want to devote to this conversation. There's a number of things on this list, not all of which we need to get to, maybe some of which we want to focus on. These are really just kind of collected here as topics that I think primarily Richard and staff had heard council members bring up over a period of time, right? And then I also saw an email late this afternoon from Randy stressing the importance of the diversity topic within this, which, of course, within our advisory board recruitment policy is one of the central features of that policy, and how it gets implemented is achieving our diversity goals. So I think that's definitely in the mix here as well. But there are a few of these on the list here that are pretty specific that I think staff is looking for some feedback on. And others that people may bring up. I just want to note that it's quite a long list of topics, and we don't want to be here all night with it. So I'd be open to suggestions about how to structure that, but I would just maybe suggest that we talk a little bit about some of the more discrete items that I think are easily dealt with. And these are just in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong. And also, Richard maybe has some.
Well, I just want to add that the liaisons to all of our committees are here tonight, so they can certainly help with any questions you all might have in terms of process, procedure, those kinds of things.
Wondering why there was so many staff in the room. It's like pretty amazing. Thank you all for being here. It's like we're having the employee appreciation party. No, thanks to you all for being here. It's great to have you. In case we need some additional perspective, I think the staff perspective on these as these liaisons is actually really important to some of these topics on the page here. So let's keep that in mind as well. But as I mentioned, I think there are 2 or 3 of these items that are pretty kind of focused in terms of getting some feedback to staff. And one of those in my mind is the draft ordinance that Brady prepared around remote participation in council meetings. It's primarily referring to remote participation by council members in council meetings, but we can certainly broaden it. But I think that's the main focus of the ordinance, and we can, if there's interest in going beyond that, we can share that with Brady. But did everyone have a chance to think about that issue? Is everyone comfortable, first of all, with the idea of remote council member participation, limited as it is described in the ordinance? And are there any questions for Brady about what's proposed in that draft ordinance? Barbara and then Susan.
No, I just, I think the thing for me was that to confirm what I thought about, the quorum has to be established physically.
I think that's right.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
The 4 of us physically.
Correct.
Space, and maybe the other 3 or whatever, however many.
Yeah.
So to me, that's like the main part of it.
Good question. Thanks for clarifying.
I'll just add real quick, and Sammy brought it up, but I inadvertently left out that kind of the same thing that we had with the Board of Adjustment, where there'd be no remote participation for quasi-judicial hearings. And that would pertain to the public as well. And the reason being is if you have witnesses that are testing remotely, that could create due process. And it's just sort of our legal take that to keep all of those type of QJ hearings to be participated in person.
Then definitely one thing to add to the list for you going out of this meeting, Brady, will be to add some provisions in there regarding quasi-judicial hearings. Okay, I think Susan?
That was what I was asking about.
Okay, great. So we clarify that. I think, it's a pretty, when I first saw the ordinance, and I want to say thanks to the staff and to Brady for preparing this. They actually prepared it a while ago, and we're just now taking it up. When I first thought, one thing that came to mind for me was, well, clearly what's driving this is the experience we had during the pandemic and things being under the state of emergency. And I just want to make sure everyone's feeling comfortable with the provisions of this draft ordinance, which are providing a list of reasons why a council member might participate remotely that are really beyond the scope of a straight up state of emergency, right? I mean, that was our condition during the 2 years from 2020 to 2022. is we were participating remotely because we were under a state of emergency. There are many other reasons listed here why a council member could choose to participate remotely, whether they're out sick or they're traveling and they want to still participate in whatever the meeting is. So I just want to make sure everyone was comfortable with the list provided in the ordinance. And are there any questions about that? I'm good with it. I just want to clarify that it's much broader than what we were previously operating with. Go ahead, Sammy.
Yeah, I'm fine with that list. Thanks for the really well written. Appreciate it. The maybe not related specifically to this ordinance, but I am interested in having the public be able to access our meetings via Zoom and communicate with us, not just watch it. And I know that's a function of technology, but I also know Roxborough apparently already does that. So it's not technology that's unknown. And so to whatever extent it's necessary to tweak this ordinance to reflect that, one area I noticed that may be the case is when it talks about all persons present at the meeting location and participating remotely is what I would add, participating remotely, are able to hear the council member who is participating remotely. And then likewise, if video technology is used, it is preferred that the remote participant is visible to all persons present at the meeting location and who are participating remotely.
Yeah, those were those comments you sent me, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, and but that being said, I am interested in us receiving a report, feedback from staff in terms of like, well, if the council is interested, whether that can be implemented or not.
Maybe seeing some examples, like you said, Roxborough maybe is doing.
Yeah, like Roxborough. Nick mentioned Roxborough was doing that, and so like.
Other council members interested in more information on that question?
I'd be interested, but I'd like to see it separate from this.
Well, I have a question. Is it actually, is this ordinance necessary for that? I mean, it seems as if, we're talking about.
It's a separate matter, I think.
Yeah. I would be interested in it myself, but it does seem, I was going to ask to clarify whether, it seems to me like once we have this, that's really like a staff and technology question, right, for format? Is that correct?
Mostly
It's going to be mostly, I think, the manager figuring out what technology is needed and the logistics and all that, and does it make sense?
Yeah.
But I agree, it's a separate matter.
And for what it's worth, the MPO does it. They have.
Let's do it. The MPO, the model of public participation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, you're right. There are, I think, and we've done it with some advisory boards. I think one or two have had remote things going on. So I think it's going to be a space, logistics, technology question ultimately.
Great. Well,
probably separate from us considering at a future meeting the adoption of this ordinance.
I'd like to underscore my desire to see it, but otherwise say
Well,
that
I'm hearing, sounds like everybody's interested in.
Otherwise, I'm good with this as is. Yeah.
Any other questions about the draft ordinance on this topic? Nope. All right. Cool. We got one of the items on the list is interpretation services, which are currently being used in some advisory boards. And I guess I'm wondering if if anybody has questions on that particular topic. If Richard, there's anything more you wanted to share on that topic.
That's prepared to talk a little bit about that if council wants to hear the work we've done so far.
Okay. Maybe if we could hear about what the current status is for that. Kat, is that okay? And again, y'all, I'm just pulling these topics because they seem like the ones that are easy to get our heads around first, and then we can
Knock them out.
that one that's really pulling at your heartstrings. Just let me know.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I know you have expressed interest in having a more formalized system for encouraging people who speak different languages to be able to engage with you and maybe with advisory boards as well. And I have been in conversation with Chicle, the Language Translation Institute. It's a minority-owned, women-owned business based in Chapel Hill. And they currently provide services for Orange County and the town of Chapel Hill. And, it looks like a really good relationship could come from this. And so it could be something as simple as adding a language access statement to agendas. That would be for town council meetings as well as advisory boards saying, you know, language access is available, call this number, and we would provide that number. And then we would pay and we would organize and facilitate that access. And I have a little slide to show how, if you want to see. So this is just a crop from the main page of the Town of Chapel Hill's agenda. And they are providing that in, I think it's Spanish, Burmese, Chinese, and Korean. We could do something very similar. We also have some equipment that we can make available to interpreters who we're able to bring in from Chicle, or maybe it's another agency. But, you know, it will be a bit of a learning process, but I think it's not as though we've not done it before here. I know that departments are always eager to help citizens to be involved, to access services, but we just need to formalize it a bit more by adding something like this to all the agendas, for example.
Would this be would this also be the way of getting language access, greater language access for members of advisory boards? Because this is kind of geared toward public, you know, participation in meetings. What about community members who are members of advisory boards, but maybe English is not their first language, and it would be more comfortable for them to participate in their own language? Is that an option here too?
I think we could think it through. I think we'd have to try to determine what that budget would look like. I have a preliminary cost from Chicle for on an hourly basis, but I think there probably would be documents that would also need to be translated in addition to the interpretation. So there would probably be two expenses there.
Barbara and then Randy.
Yeah. Thank you, Kat. I just wanted to clarify. So you're mentioning this information for the agenda packet. And so I'm assuming that it would show up like everywhere, like even in email blasts and on the website. And so it would just be everywhere, the
It
same
would just
information.
basically
Okay.
be like our disclaimer or, yeah, the standard language.
Pretty much anywhere you're thank you. That's all I needed. Thanks.
Yeah, my question tags with what Damon was asking regarding documents. So sometimes we have project documents that not only are our advisory boards discussing it, but councils discussing projects or joint reviews, and many times they could be projects that immediately impact a community that may have dual language or single language that's not English. I would like to see that we find out how documents can be translated so that community is given the opportunity to get as much information on things that may impact them. And sometimes it's not even if it's contiguous to a particular neighborhood. It could be something like, you know, like when we were doing the deliberations about the 203 library, which is something that impacts a full community. So, you know, I think there needs to be more conversation about what is community looking for in terms of becoming more engaged. And I think that's also a conduit for creating creating greater civic engagement and feeling of inclusion when they know that the documents are being discussed and they can have access in their own language. Because the jargon, oh my God, the jargon that we all know, is part of our own learning curve. I can't imagine what it would be for someone who is not a native English speaker.
Absolutely. And, we are tracking some of the analytics on our website, for example. So we know what some of the translation browsers, the most common ones, what languages people are coming in using. Spanish is number one, and surprisingly, perhaps, Korean is very high in Carrboro. So there's, we do have Google Translate on our website, and that is helpful. It's not perfect, but it is helpful. And not every government has their website, has the Google Translate available. So, and PDFs are a complication as well.
Well, and certainly when, for example, we have an agenda item and, there's certain jargon in it, there needs to be an explanation that MPO, what that stands for, what it needs. You see what I'm saying? Because we shouldn't make the tacit assumption that people going to see it and immediately know what it also means. So
Plain language is a good practice for us all to access and become engaged. Absolutely, I agree.
And can I just, and I'm going to go to Eleazar in just one sec. I'm thinking that I feel like I've seen the school district doing some materials in other languages than English. I might be misremembering this completely, but can you just check to see if the local school district has been posting agenda materials in, I believe it's,
Okay.
I might be imagining this. Eleazar, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So first, thank you for bringing this and the work that's already been done for language equity. I think it's extremely important and is one of the things that, as everyone on this table knows, is something that I've been working for in and outside of this council. So two things. First, when can we start seeing this on our agenda? Do you need direction from council? Like what needs to happen in order for us to start having this publicly available?
I mean, this is, I just made it. These were some of the costs that I've pulled from Chicle, and I think this is doable as a trial fairly soon. And of course, we're working on that language access plan, and that is something that we want to bring to you to review and to contribute to, and then that would be adopted. I don't think we have to wait for that plan in order to start this. And the reason I say it's a little bit of a pilot is because we really have no idea. I have no idea of how many people will utilize the service. So I mean, we have funds now till the end of the year that can be used. And I'd love to give it a try and start as soon as possible. And then working with Wesley, of course, on the agendas and having to kind of organize all those face sheets of the packets to be sure that we have common language across them all.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, because I would love to see this happen.
Can I pause there and just ask, is there interest in Kat's idea of maybe giving this a run for a bit and working with the manager, of course, to bring a proposal forward for approval by the council at a future meeting? Okay, sounds like there's support for that. Okay. Go ahead, Eleazar.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. And along those lines, I would, we talked about the planning. I agree. I think we could get a lot of these things moving before we have that before us. But I am curious if you have capacity to kind of figure or just bring to council as we're looking at budget, what would those two additional costs be, right? If we were to implement this after this trial period and we want to move forward with it, I would like to see, of course, translation interpretation for services, but as well as documents is something that I want to see us have. So if possible, just give us some numbers on that so we can deliberate as we're looking at the budget.
I would foresee that the plan would have a list of priority documents that we would then be working on translating over a period of time. but what are those key documents? What do we start with? Yes, thank you.
You can imagine it being those face pages, for example, with the agenda abstract or something like
And
that.
other services and other kinds of forms and things that people need to access in the community.
Who's in next? Or was it Danny? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Danny.
I don't feel
Danny and
strongly.
then Barbara.
I was just going to offer that maybe council materials and joint review materials would be the right place to start in terms of just benchmarking that on top of like thereafter. I would be interested in just like, I would imagine, I hope it's a light-ish capacity sort of audit within the departments, just what is most commonly accessed, you know, just kind of rounding up what forms and things like that. But from sort of an official point of view, I would think the joint review packets and council packets would be pretty comprehensive.
I was just piggybacking on what Eleazar just said, and you know, when I look at this, I look at it as a piece of the broader language equity plan that, you know, Eleazar had been talking about for a while, and I understand about the pilot portion and all that, but I guess at some point I would be looking for how to just get this regularly into a budget and just regularly into our, I think this is a part of just that broader issue. So I don't know where we are with that. I guess budget season is upon us, and we will just kind of talk, I guess, a little bit more about how to do that, because I don't want this to keep coming back, you know, every time we are talking about language equity and or assistance, you know, to just go ahead and make some kind of good decision about it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So Kat, could you tell us, you mentioned that the language access plan that you've been working on, is that, you mentioned something's coming before us at some point to review, or?
Well, we have applied for a grant from the Building Integrated Communities project through UNC, and I have not heard back yet from them. I'm hopeful that we can get some. Yeah, you wrote a letter in support of the grant application, and we're waiting to hear back. We don't, you know, they're going to, if we receive the grant, that will be a great support toward really helping to enhance whatever plan we come up with. I mean, we have a draft underway, and that's been there. But, you know, if for some reason we don't receive the grant, we can still proceed and give you a time frame for that very soon.
So you still have a proposal?
Yeah.
Okay. The next one, I'm just working through this list in my own random order, but Susan, did you have a question about this topic?
Very, very quick. Well, actually, it's a comment I wanted to add to Danny's list. I have talked to folks who have seen the forms for applying for Parks and Rec programs and had trouble there, so that would be another great spot to include this language assistance.
All right, thank you for that, Susan. All right, so next is the topic of advisory board stipends. This is something that I believe that we included in the budget for this year, but there hasn't really been a program built around how to do it yet. So I'd love some ideas from folks about what that might be. I believe in the agenda packet we got some information about Chapel Hill's policy and how they approach it. Pat, thank you, by the way. And so I'm interested in ideas. Barbara, did you have a comment?
No,
Susan?
it wasn't about that, because I feel like we're getting to a larger discussion potentially now. And so I did want to at least just bring in just one thing that I've been thinking about, and was based on a conversation that I heard in our last Community Safety Task Force meeting. And, you know, I think we really need to go ahead and add in task force, you know, any task force or group that the town council appoints. So, you know, to kind of close the loop on that, unless we're going to write something completely new, because I believe I remember in the Community Safety Task Force, somebody may have asked the question that something, I don't know if you or Sammy remember, but I think one of the members may have asked, we're a task force, and are we within the guardrails of the advisory boards and commissions? And, the answer to me is yes. And this is a good time, I think, to add any task force that we appoint people to or create in any other group, because then that closes the loop on that, pretty much. Because we did hand out these very guidelines to that task force. I believe it's the only task force we have rolling right now. So I did want to put that on the table for consideration.
I agree with you, Barbara. I think, yes, any task force, advisory board, commission, team that we appoint as an advisory thing, I agree should be covered by our adopted guidelines. Is there anybody else?
I mean, amending, just to clarify, like the title of the procedure manual, like rules and procedure for town of Carrboro boards, task force commissions,
Or maybe just having,
some way to include it.
yeah, making sure that maybe staff, when you go through the document, making sure that it's clear in there that it does apply to all of these advisory bodies.
Wouldn't be anything too major, but add a
Good to clarify.
Mhm.
Yeah. Since Barbara's right, the question did come up in our community safety task force meeting about how these applied. So.
And that was it. Go ahead.
Since we're on potential amendments here, to the rules, I think one that has come up in two different advisory boards for me from members is this question about subcommittees. And at some point, we did get clarification from Nick, and generally speaking, I believe what he said was, as long as they can meet, as long as it's not a quorum, they don't have to officially make it a subcommittee, which also translates into it not requiring staff time and minute taking to the same degree. And so if we could just make that clearer so that way a member of an advisory board can read it and kind of know it's written there. It doesn't have to be a mystery, and we don't have to, continually be asking staff or depend on staff to get that answer. I think that would help.
I think that's another thing that came up, Sammy, in the community safety task force meeting. Is that right?
Right.
So yeah, I agree. It would be nice to include maybe something in the guidelines about, just to answer that question. We have gotten pretty good advice from the attorney about, well, clearly if you're establishing a formal subcommittee, that becomes a public body that needs to be supported by staff resources and minutes taken and all of those things. But, we also talked about the model of there may be times when a couple of advisory board members have agree, hey, we'll go and study that issue, and bring back some information for you. It's less formal in that way. It's not an appointed committee, but they've agreed to do some homework between meetings and then come back to the larger group and kind of report on the homework they did. Does that,
Like
Brady?
they did like a site visit somewhere together, and there's two of them, or they obviously have to sort of be together, right, for that issue to come up. But yeah, that's exactly right.
And the example that came up the other night was, a couple of members said, well, yeah, I'll go read up on some of these case studies, and then we'll come back and report back on what we read. And then another couple of members were going to go back and just, do some other little homework assignment. I don't remember. So I agree with Sammy, though. I think it would be useful for advisory board members and for the rest of us to just spell that out a little bit in the document.
The council does it all the time. Like we have groups working on a resolution, and
right. But it's clearly not meant to be committee work,
right,
in that formal sense. Yeah.
But we will know. There'll be like a report back or something. Not anything formal. They don't have to do minutes.
Ever has a quorum.
Yeah.
And then just getting confirmation with whatever language staff comes up with that it's falling within the bounds of the open meetings law and all that.
The other aspect of this too is I know that it would be helpful for members of boards to have some degree of guidance, not as a requirement, but a guidance in terms of what would be appropriate as a formal subcommittee versus an informal one. Because one represents staff time and resources, the other one not at all. And so to whatever extent there could be some degree of guidance so a board member can kind of discern better when a subcommittee would be appropriate or not. I think that would be helpful. An example, maybe just an example.
Well, there is some language in section 12.
Right.
I think what I'll do is ask the staff liaisons to take a look at this as well, because I know they've had some concerns about some of these subcommittees, and we'll look at this and maybe come up and propose some additional language that might be helpful.
That would be great.
How these are managed.
Yeah, and look at Nick's response to this question. I'll find it and I'll forward it again because he did respond to it. Thanks.
Right. Since we are in this topic of the rules of procedure for town boards and commissions, we might as well sit in that for a minute longer. So we talked about subcommittees. Thanks for touching on that. We jumped away from that for the moment. So we'll do that in a minute. And thanks for the check there. I will just note it is now after 9 o'clock. So just keep an eye on the clock. One thing that has been coming up in a number of boards that I know of and I've been hearing from staff about is making sure that everyone understands their roles in advisory board meetings. The one that I'll tackle just right off the bat is the role of the council liaison. And the reason I want to tackle that one is because it's one that's dear to my heart, because as somebody who has both served on advisory boards and been a liaison to advisory boards, probably I'll just say I'm very guilty and have been guilty and probably continue to be guilty of being one of those council liaisons who chimes in a lot. I try not to do that these days, but it's certainly something that I've done and have been guilty of. And part of it's because I've been on these advisory boards and just wanted to keep doing it, right? But I think it's important for us, just as a general reminder, to maybe go back and read the language in our guidelines about the role of the council liaison. And that being that it's primarily a listening role, so that we can faithfully report back to the council what we've heard in our advisory board meeting. And then secondarily, it's an opportunity to offer advice on primarily process questions that may come up from the advisory board. And we're there as a representative of the council to offer some insight into process matters. But it's just an opportunity to remind each other and maybe find a way to hold each other accountable to this notion that outside of that, we really should be resisting the urge, as strong as it can be sometimes, to participate in advisory board discussion. And I think there's a lot of value in advisory board members feeling a sense of their own autonomy and working through problems and questions together as appointed boards without a lot of participation by council members. And I also think that it makes things less awkward sometimes for staff if we're a little more attentive to our role and the responsibility we have not to be chiming in too much. Because that can put also our staff liaisons in an awkward position of not understanding who they should be listening to and what they're responding to. So I just wanted to put that on the table. And one thing I'm wondering is there any way we need to adapt the language that we have in our existing guidelines, or do we feel like it's pretty clear and we just need the reminder, or should we adapt the language in some way to be clearer about what the expectation is, or are we all good?
I thought it was clear.
I have one question.
Sure. Randy?
We used to actually report back, if you remember.
Old days, yeah.
Yeah, so I have no sense of how helpful that was. I'm sorry I'm wearing the mask. I started to sneeze and I want to be sure, sneezing to myself. So I don't know, if that's something that might be valuable so that we're cross-pollinating what we know.
The example of that, thanks for raising that, because I forgot that tended to happen more frequently. Example that comes to mind is when we would be doing some kind of development review, and each of us, I think, is a liaison to one of the sort of big development review advisory boards. And it would be helpful, I thought, in some of those meetings when we were considering whatever the application was, for the liaison to the planning board to say, here's what I heard the planning board talking about. We have their written recommendation. Can the liaison offer any insights into what they heard during that conversation? So we did do that.
Well, and the reason I bring this up, because even just tonight, talking about the difference in the perception of the question of paid parking between the climate action team, of which I'm a liaison there, and the Race Equity Commission, of which I'm also liaison with Barbara. If this board would have heard us say, what we had heard at those two boards, Sammy and I are on one and Barbara and I are on the other, it might have helped inform, how did the Race Equity Commission, what was that conversation like? What was the conversation like for,
I mean, I think that's one of the main points of having a council liaison is that we can be reporting to each other what we observed or heard in the discussion, right? That we're there to listen, take it in, come back to the council and share what we learned. So I agree with you, Randy. I think that's that's really the main value, apart from, again, offering some procedural or advice to the advisory boards themselves. Sammy, go ahead.
Yeah, what I will do sometimes is when they're having a discussion, it's one thing to like fill in the gaps of what that discussion was when we are meeting. It's another thing to just have it written. And so one of my roles as a liaison is to make sure that they make sure that all their recommendations are included written so that I don't have to be counted on as much.
Great idea.
To bring it across. So that's one way to get to it. And then there are nuances, of course, and that I feel is kind of like when I can step in and clarify something for the council. There's another aspect to this that I wanted to point out, but I'm blanking on it. And so I may come back to it.
Susan, and then did you have your hand? Oh, okay.
It's a little bit it's still very related to this topic. It's this question. I've also heard some people, advisory board members, comment that there is not as much communication between the chairs and the staff as they wish. And this could be everything from the setting of expectations about an advisory board, the creating of the agenda for the advisory board. One person mentioned to me that, as an example, an advisory board meeting ended up being canceled when the chair of the advisory board actually had some really important things that they wanted to have on the agenda for the meeting. Which is all to say, I was going to suggest that, I don't know if it's once a year, twice a year, that all of the board chairs and then the staff liaison meet and have a training, if you will, or even just an exchange of reminders on the expectations, on the setting of agendas, the roles, the responsibilities of the advisory boards. I think it would probably be a good idea, even just once a year, really, to have this opportunity to be really clear on our roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, thanks for that, Susan. I wonder if we did. Trish will remember this from years ago. There was one point where I think I was on the planning board. There was this whole big thing where they did a advisory board training. It was primarily around kind of the ethical requirements and all that stuff. And then the town recorded it and it was available online. I think it may still be available.
Yeah, we started that when I was at the first go round. In fact, Trish and I and a couple of staffers put together a whole module. That I think I still have my notes, Trish. I don't know if you do or not, but we did a whole module around that.
But I wonder, sort of bouncing off of Susan's idea, at the very least, once a year for each advisory board needs to be having a review of the guidelines. Because we're appointing new people all the time, and they may not have gotten it, at whatever time it was done. And we certainly found, and Barbara hinted at this earlier, that when we had a recent community safety task force meeting, they hadn't even seen the guidelines, or they didn't seem to have seen the guidelines before, or know that they existed. And so when we brought it in to kind of share with them and say, hey, y'all, this is kind of the expectation around how the advisory board operate, they were like, oh, well, this would have been nice to know, So I think it might be useful, Mr. Manager, for the advisory boards to maybe it's once a year. Agenda item number 1 is, here's how it works, and just share the guidelines, include those in the packet, make sure that maybe the staff liaison or whoever goes through it and kind of educates the advisory board members about what's in the guidelines. Barbara, I'm going to add you to the list. I got Susan. Were you?
That's it. Mm-hmm.
So Barbara, you're next, and then Randy.
And so I'm piggybacking a little bit off what Susan just said about the staff liaison and the chair. And so, it's easy for the lines to get blurred in these advisory board meetings. Sometimes, as the mayor mentioned earlier, he finds himself wanting to chime in like the old days. But it says here that the staff liaison serves as staff support to the board, it should be clearly noted that staff work is directed only by the department director or their supervisor. And so staff liaison should refer to their supervisor with any questions related to advisory board work. And so the staff liaison is to develop agendas and guide the work of the advisory board as directed by the town council. And I say this because staff liaison, I mean, that's a very clear role, and I don't see it as one that can be, like shared with the chair or, I mean, I would look to the staff liaison when I come into the meeting. But then the chair, of course, is the chair of the group and helps, to facilitate discussion and I guess move the agenda along. But I see those as being like two very different roles because I mean, we can't go in and tell the staff liaison. I mean, it's just kind of already laid out. So I just didn't want the lines to get blurred there, with the staff liaison and the chair of the group. Mr. White, I don't know if there was something you wanted to say. Does that? Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was thinking.
I think that, thank you for reading that out. That is really important. And I'll come to you real quick, Sammy. When you were talking, I was thinking too about a related point. Role of the staff liaison. It's the staff liaison. The staff liaison doesn't report to the advisory board, right? They don't get directed by the advisory board. And I think a related point, in my mind anyway, is that the advisory board is advising the council. The advisory board is not advising staff. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is we appoint them to advise us. And so I think sometimes we want to be clear. And I don't know if there's any language that needs to be tweaked in that policy, Mr. Manager, to just make that clear as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficulties there is that there's a problem in that because it's staff that makes the agenda, if an advisory board wants to make a recommendation to the town council, it can't do so unless staff has made that as part of the agenda. But they can't do that because here it says under meeting agenda, items that will require a vote and recommendation back to the town council may not be added to the agenda at the meeting.
Yeah, I think I agree that needs some clarification because I think what that's anticipating, maybe I'll get this wrong and maybe all the staff liaisons will riot when I say this, but the idea is in my mind that if the advisory board wants something to get on the agenda for one of their meetings, they need to decide that in a meeting to be on a future agenda. I think the importance of that is these agendas go out and they're publicly available,
right.
And you don't want advisory boards taking up matters of business that were not announced previously in the publicly available agenda.
You need to spell that out.
That point means to
So
be
maybe we
clear.
need to make that clearer, Mr. Manager.
Yep.
It's not that advisory boards are prohibited from taking up the matters they want to take up. It's that they need to follow a process to get it onto their table. Okay, next I have Randy.
Yeah, thank you, Sammy, for raising that question because, I think, well, there's two things I want to say. First, I know that that chairs feel and advisory boards feel they are the direct voice of the community to the council through their advisory board on whatever topic it is, and that there have been times that chairs have wanted to add things to the agenda a month ahead and have not been able to do so because there's no place on the agenda for them to formally make the request. And it's not uniform with all advisory boards. So I think part of what we need to clarify to staff is how we see that the chairs can make requests that come from their advisory board to agendas to make sure they all understand, number one, they can do that we expect that they would because they're representing community, and that in a timely fashion it will surface onto an agenda, because that does not seem to be uniform amongst advisory boards. Some Some have a lot of co-construction on agendas, which makes the advisory board very happy. And others, it seems to be a more, it's a process where they're not sure they have that flexibility. Right. So that's number one. Number two, the advisory board, we have at least 2, potentially 3 advisory boards that no longer fit the same model as advisory boards have historically had, in that they're expected to have a component that is community engagement. And because of that, their role is, one of where they want to be more active, which that's part of an agenda question, but it's also part of, how much flexibility do you give them to have subcommittee, and how are we going to look at how, they move forward in a somewhat different style. And I say that because the Race Equity Commission, for example, last year, they really wanted to do a survey at Carrboro Day. They put it together, they went out there, they did it. Awesome. And they were very happy to do that, and it excited and motivated the REC to do what they're continuing to do. Likewise, with the climate action team, who have, God, they blow the top out of the room with all their great ideas. And one of the reasons that they're looking to increase membership is so they have more people who can get out and do the work of green neighborhoods. But those 2 advisory boards do not fit the traditional model. So we need to have a conversation so that we understand how best to work with staff, so that these advisory boards that have direct engagement components intentionally baked into their charter, so that they can do their work. So those are the 2 things.
Thanks for raising those. And I think that the tension is that we don't want to be putting that workload onto staff.
Exactly.
Right? Which is kind of what ends up happening.
They want to do the work.
Yeah.
Sammy, go ahead.
And thanks, Randy, for bringing this into this agenda item, which actually came up during the last climate update that we had. It's expressed itself in the climate team, for example, where someone wanted to go talk to business owners about and survey them about a specific question having to do with engaging them in the neighborhood, green neighborhoods, but for businesses. But there was a question in terms of like, can they do that? Who are they representing? How can they present themselves? Are they on behalf of the town, this task force, or themselves? And I think maybe, Randy, that getting to this point that you've raised again is there's some language, guidance that can be included for those kinds of advisory board task force, so that members won't have to bring this up ad hoc and then we're scrambling to get that answer. It's just written in the.
Mr. Manager, I wonder if, given that I think one of the challenges is that it becomes very easy to bleed into staff effort, right? Instead of, as Randy and Sammy are envisioning, it's really advisory board members taking the lead and making some of this engagement activity happen. Could we get some recommendation from staff about what that model looks like?
Yes.
for these? And because Randy's right, we have these 2 or 3 advisory boards where we've intentionally made that part of their charge to be engaged, be doing engagement activities to inform their work, but we haven't. But then we've kind of dropped staff liaisons in the middle of this and expected them to. I mean, they're the ones that end up bearing the brunt of that. Even in a situation where the advisory board members actually want to be doing the work, but it's not clear how to structure it. Does that make sense?
It does, yes.
Okay. So Sammy, you were done, right? Okay, Susan, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Sammy. I just wanted to add one thing to that, Mr. Manager. I know with the invasive species removal, there was this new language that was being developed that would allow that to occur sort of volunteer-led as opposed to staff-led, which was really coming along. And so I was just going to suggest that as sort of a template that could be used for the same thing.
Another example maybe to look to, and I may be misremembering how this all went down. Trish or Tina or others from the planning department may remember better than I do, but when at one point on the planning board, they started doing these community month activities. Now, I'm probably misremembering the extent of effort that staff ended up putting into those activities, but I'm thinking about those were where this planning board wanted to do some kind of, observance or activity, whether it was a panel discussion or some other educational thing. I just don't remember if that might not be a great example. Maybe you can talk to planning staff. It was for planning month, but I'm just, maybe to Mr. Manager, I may be misremembering how much staff effort actually was required for that. But if that ends up being a good example, it's another one to point to as one where the advisory board members were trying to do some community engagement. All right. Roles of liaisons, roles of chairs. I think on the issue of training, I think chairs getting some training in how to run a meeting is always valuable. It's another thing to be considering. Other things on that topic of roles of council liaisons, chairs, and staff that we need to cover, Mr. Manager. Chris,
I think that covers everything I can remember, but I'll check back in with staff as well.
Back to stipends. Ready for stipends, y'all? Okay, so we have money in the budget for this fiscal year that was set aside for some kind of stipend program for advisory board members, but we haven't got anything. We haven't decided how to do it. So I'm interested in people's ideas about what to do with that, and we had some examples in the packet. So Danny, go ahead.
I would love to do it. Love to follow Chapel Hill's model. I would like to round up to an even 15 an hour with the half hour for transit for $7.50. I pay my babysitter $15 an hour. I think this is a nice way to do it, but I do want to make it opt-in. I think if we were to pursue that, it would be really great.
We have that Chapel Hill model, which was interesting and seemed relatively simple, straightforward.
And I think I agree. I think we should have in the language of how to do this, keep it a living wage.
Yeah. It should be tied to that. It should rise if it rises. So 60.
1660.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm a bad babysitter employer.
And it's adjusted
Annually
for
adjust.
rent each year.
So we have an opt-in program inspired by the model that Chapel Hill's using, but using a figure that's pegged to the living wage.
If my babysitter is listening, I owe you a raise. She's probably not.
Barbara.
And so, just to clarify, following the Chapel Hill model, that's quarterly, right? I think they're paid
to opt in.
to the people who opt in, and so I like the opt in. And so I'm trying to remember back to when the conversation started and why we feel like this is the way to go with advisory boards. To offer up this stipend, and then just realizing I think about some of the people that are currently serving on some of our advisory boards, and just knowing they're doing it because they're genuinely interested in the work. And not necessarily, any kind of financial incentive or whatever. And they would probably turn it down. But just trying to remember going back, is this just like some type of incentive? Are we hoping to attract? Like, what is the end goal of the stipend?
I guess I would say in my mind, and I'm just speaking from my perspective, that one of my main interests was in lowering barriers to participation, right? So folks who, for example, have childcare needs and otherwise wouldn't be able to afford childcare and therefore participate in an advisory board meeting, or transportation needs. So that kind of
But we have Zoom for some of our advisory boards now, so they're able to be home. You don't have to move the car, and you don't have to have a babysitter. It's not all of them.
I think the childcare is really important. I do think even with Zoom, like you can't do both well.
I was just stating the obvious, No, you can't do both, but I mean, that's certainly a thing as we continue with the Zoom meeting.
I agree. That hybrid participation is certainly another step we've taken to try to lower those barriers. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I had, go ahead, Randy.
Thank you, Barbara, for bringing that up. I'm just going to bring the. I can completely get behind this, but I want to raise a question, and I wonder if this is part of what your question is. And I'm going to give you an example. When I was teaching in the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools, we wanted to expand the involvement of parents in PTA meetings at Colbreth. And we've really wrestled with, do we, give parents a stipend in order to be able for them to come to PTA meetings. And what we ended up piloting, and it worked for the time that I was there anyway, was that we offered parents an opportunity to bring the children, have the children in the library. We provided like pizza and snacks, and we had some high school students come in and give homework assistance. And in other words, we made it more of a community engagement together so that everything would rise up together in the service. Made it about the service and not about the cash. And I throw this out there because models like that work, whether it's the transportation, providing the transportation, or providing food, or providing homework assistance and coverage. And if we were to explore something like that, I think it would be a way to not only involve our youth council and YAB, but high school students in giving back. And I throw that out because sometimes we just have to realize that community engagement, because people want to be engaged, is maybe, the higher goal. And I'm just putting, not that I can't get behind it, I can completely get behind this, but I just want us to expect the best, not only from ourselves and our community in terms of building deeper community together, not because there's a price tag attached. So I'm just putting it out there that there are other ways, and there are other ways that are meaningful, that don't have to be giving somebody $15 an hour. So, but thank you for.
Thank you,
bringing
Randy.
that up.
One thing that's coming to mind in Randy's comments is that Chapel Hill, when I read Chapel Hill's website, it linked to the website, it was a lot more information on the webpage about their program. And it was pitched as a pilot. And I'd be interested, Mr. Manager, in knowing what they learned during that experience. They started in 28, like before the pandemic, so I don't know how much experience they've actually ended up having with the program, but it might be nice to just use that information to inform what we're doing here. In my mind, the idea of a stipend is attractive because it's simple. It's relatively low administrative burden for the staff to implement. There will be some tax forms and so on, I think, if we follow the Chapel Hill model. But ultimately, if the goal here is to reduce barriers to participation, which in my mind is the goal, yes, we want people to participate because they want to do the work. There are people who don't have that flexibility because they don't have the ability to, for example, pay for childcare, pay for transportation. And if this helps lower those barriers, that's great. The pilot that Chapel Hill runs makes clear in their kind of preamble statement that the intent of the program is to support people in childcare and transportation expenses, and it's an opt-in program. It makes clear that's the point. So I think there'd be value in trying it out. Elizar.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so I'm fully in favor of stipends, not only for what you already mentioned, but I'm also strong. I have a strong belief that we need to pay people for their time, and yes, we want folks to do it, and yes, we know that a lot of our folks on these committees are dedicated volunteers. But I also want it's just part of my work outside of being on this council that we need to pay people for their time. And Of course, it's an opt-in, so not everyone will get it, but yeah. So I just wanted to say that fully in favor of this and want it implemented, whether it's as a pilot for temporary reasons or not, but definitely want to do it.
Is there a general consensus about staff moving forward with a proposal on this? Barbara, go ahead.
And so my last comment, I'm not in favor of it, but I do want it to be brought forth in the right spirit. Let me just go ahead and say I don't think that is going to increase our diversity, because I think people have different reasons why they don't want to serve or why they've been turned off about serving. So I don't think that it's going to help that. And so I hope we're not going into this with that mindset, because I'm not so sure that that's what the answer is.
Barbara. And I think it'll be interesting to see what the impact actually is when we try it out. Mr. Manager, is that enough direction?
Yes.
Also, the budgetary impact.
And the budgetary impact.
It's just hard to know. I think one of the towns, it was 60% of the people actually, opted in. If it struck me as quite high. And so we'll want to see where we go with this in terms of just the budgetary consequences.
Thank you, Susan. Okay. Time check. 9:36. All right. So I want to make sure that we get to a couple of quick things, what I think could be quick things. There's an item on here about, and Sammy, I am going to get to the climate action team. I'm saving that best for last. And I just want to say again how much I appreciate that all the staff are in the room and that you're actually sticking with us. I really appreciate your time. I know this is sort of outside the normal workday for you. So thank you. We're going to move this along. The first item on this list of various items is potential consolidation of advisory boards. We don't need to get into a whole thing about this right now. I would actually be more interested in hearing from staff about what other local communities have done in this regard recently. I know that the town of Chapel Hill several years ago did a consolidation and restructuring of their advisory boards. And without something information like that to just play around with, I don't want to get into a sort of just meandering conversation about that topic here. But I do have a specific ask on the topic of consolidation, and that is the Youth Advisory Board. I wanted to recommend, or at least have you all think about the idea of consolidating the Youth Advisory Board with the Youth Council.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
There's a lot of overlap already.
Oh, there were two.
Yeah. There's already a lot of really great staff level engagement and organization around the Youth Council. And maybe the idea is we add a component to the Youth Council that's that kind of Citizens Academy thing that we bring to the Youth Advisory Board. But since there's already so much overlap, anyway, I'm not seeing, okay, I've got some agreement on that. All right.
Yeah.
So Mr. Manager, we're going to look for a proposal from staff on consolidating those two bodies. Is that okay?
And any preference? I know one is based in the manager's office, in the mayor's office. One is in recreation, parks and cultural resources.
I want to take advantage of the fact that they've got a good model going in Parks and Rec, in Recreation and Parks. But I am sincere about wanting to add this kind of Civics Academy component to it.
Right. Yeah.
Which I'm happy to work with Wesley on to bring that element to it, which was really the point of the YAB in the first place. Okay, so consensus around that. Great. Barbara?
I wanted to make sure that we got to, are we going to talk about E? Because I had a suggestion.
Yeah, let's do that next.
So for E, one thing that
Sorry, what is E?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's liaisons between boards.
Oh, we have printouts, sorry.
Will we come back to the consolidations, or we?
Oh, we went, go ahead.
Oh, let her go ahead.
Go ahead,
I'm
Susan.
going to be really quick, Barbara. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. So the Appearance Commission would like to be renamed Appearance and Urban Design. So I just wanted to throw that out as a possibility to take on that broader role. In terms of what could be a easy merge, I just wanted to throw this out. Orange County Human Relations Commission and the Human Services Advisory Commission. I know the
Well, just so we take efficient use of our time, the
Yes.
Human Relations Commission is a county advisory board that we get to appoint one member to, but it's not otherwise a town board. So that's no consolidation required.
Got you.
And I saw OWASA's board on the list as well. We just appoint to that board.
We just appoint to the OWASA board. Yeah, that's right.
I got you.
But it's not a town advisory board.
The only other thing I wanted to mention then is the EAB, I understand, has not met for a year now. Is that right? So
That's
I
true.
wondered about just making that almost like a subcommittee or what have you of climate action.
Why hasn't I'm sorry to interrupt you. Why hasn't the EAB met?
It's been, Randy, you can speak to that better than I.
I don't, they're very much involved with joint review, so I would ask Laura.
We haven't had any joint reviews.
We have had joint reviews.
Oh, we have?
Yeah. Maybe Richard, could staff answer the question of why the EAB has not been meeting?
Yes.
Okay. Laura, welcome. It's finally your moment.
It's clear all night.
Yes, so the EAB, when the climate action team was formed last fall, I think last November was their first meeting, 2 or 3 of the EAB members chose to move to be on the climate action team. So at that point, the EAB was down to 3 members, and one of the members had an issue with scheduling. They were taking a class and couldn't make some meetings, so there was basically a quorum issue for a few months, and then Wesley, I think it was a few months ago, this fall, October, the seats were filled. We finally got enough applicants, and so now there are 7 members. However, for a few months this fall, there wasn't joint review, so they weren't able to meet. And then the opportunities that they have had to attend joint review, there have been quorum issues as well. So
Thank you so
that's
much.
what's been happening.
This is actually reminding me of something I've wanted to share, an observation about this idea that boards need quorum at joint review. I'm pretty sure if you read the town code that the joint advisory board does not require a quorum. And so if boards are, for whatever, not coming together for joint review because they don't have a quorum, that should not be a barrier. So maybe I need to be checked on that fact, but I'm pretty sure that the town code specifies the joint advisory board does not require a quorum for any board participating.
Yeah.
The EAB was meeting prior.
They were meeting, and then they were finishing their
And then they
comments
were gone.
afterwards.
Oh, I see.
Right,
That's
so a couple of them did watch the joint review, but they weren't able to have comments because
It sounds like we're doing better on the quorum issue now.
yeah, we have a full board technically, so I'm hoping we'll have quorum soon.
Does the EAB, is their sole responsibility to be reviewing and weighing in on the development projects?
That's one, but their charge is also broader. They also do talk about climate and other items, but since the climate action team was formed, the climate action team is where the main focus now is. Climate items.
So that is making me wonder if it makes sense just to fold the EAB into the climate, since part of it is they're having those conversations about climate anyway. And you have strong feelings about that.
Yeah, I have strong feelings, Susan, because it took us many years to separate them. And the reason why we separated them was that we weren't really talking about climate at all, because we were having a lot of joint meetings, joint sessions, and commenting on other environmental issues that weren't specific to implementing the climate action plan. And now there's more of a focus with the climate action team. So I definitely, especially since we just separated them, would not want to join them again because our recent experience was that didn't work.
I hear you. Do you feel like there is enough of a charge for the EAB to have regular meetings and the group feeling like their work is meaningful?
Yeah, I think definitely it is really great to have that climate perspective in joint review, for sure, because there's a lot of ways you can work to make meaningful impacts in that regard. But yeah, I do think that maybe we should clarify more, the charges of the two boards, if they are very separate, or if there is overlap, maybe that's a.
I think it would be good if it in fact, and I remember these conversations that Sammy's referring to, of course, where it seemed like there were people interested in being on the EAB to participate in the development review process. Whereas there were other people who were much more interested in focusing on climate action, which was the main motivation for getting them separated. But that means we need to make sure that EAB is having all the opportunities they need to actually participate in the development review process and by attending joint review or whatever. So if there are recommendations, Laura, maybe that in talking with your department head and with the manager about how to achieve that, since that's their main purpose at this point is to participate in joint review, I'd be interested in seeing some work on that. Okay, thanks so much. All right. Other questions about, okay, perfect. Thank you, Susan. Barbara, liaisons between boards.
So I'm looking at E, so it says amend rules of procedure, staff liaison, chair attendance. And so when I'm looking at attendance, 117 of our policy. So it says unless the chair waives the requirement, members shall be removed if they are absent for 3 consecutive meetings, or if they miss more than 30% of the meetings during a 12-month period. So my whole thing about that is I would like to see unless the chair waives the requirement, and the staff liaison comes up with the attendance, it goes directly to the town clerk, and then it just goes from there. Because I just feel like that's cleaner. Unless
Take that part out.
take it out unless somebody has strong feelings about it, or if there's a particular reason that I'm not seeing to have that in there, because it just, you're removing the middleman, and the staff liaison gets the attendance, it goes directly to Wesley, and then whatever needs. I don't know about that.
Barbara, I'm not on, does the chair still have an opportunity to waive it in what you're
I would
describing?
say remove that, and the reason why I say that, this is a small community, and folks know each other, and I would rather see us follow our policy and have it circumvented by having this particular piece in there. I mean, you see what I'm saying? That it just goes straight from the staff liaison to West.
Basically, be a little more strict about the attendance requirement,
Pretty much.
Well, it takes
not
a
having an out.
subjective element in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if it's written in the policy that the chair can waive it, that it is policy, like we wouldn't be circumventing it because.
I don't agree.
So, but putting
That's okay. You go
putting
ahead.
semantics aside, yeah, I don't know why. I'm trying to think of why the chair can waive it.
A long period. But I also kind of see the point that, like, if you can't participate in the advisory board,
Right.
Well, now you can participate remotely,
now you can
so
participate remotely. So maybe it does make sense to
it's
tighten it up a little bit. Would y'all be comfortable with doing that?
Is that okay? Buddy?
at the subjectivity.
Understood, Mr. Manager? Mr. Clerk?
Gonna have trouble with.
Thanks for raising that. The other reason that item, y'all, is on the list, and I don't know that we need to really make necessarily any headway here, especially if we're tightening up the attendance issue, but there are a few examples in our advisory boards where we have these cross representations between boards, right? So I'm trying to remember an example.
Oh, you have people.
Right. So
Quentin Harper.
yeah, I'm trying to, I wish I could remember, so we have boards that are representing each other.
Yeah.
They have representatives across the boards. It's getting close to 10, y'all. Is that presenting issues? I'm trying to remember why that's on
I
this
don't
list.
think we ever took that up, did we? About more than one? Is that what you're talking about? Something about more than one?
Mr. Manager?
I think the issue I remember is where there's a liaison from one board who's going to another, that person's not showing up. I think is what I was.
That's what it is. There's been an issue with a couple of boards where there is a seat reserved on an advisory board for a member from another board, but that person hasn't been attending. And so it's sort of defeating the purpose of having that relationship between the boards.
And creating quorum issues, I understand, in
And
some
creating
cases.
quorum issues.
Then they don't show up.
So do we make
Can we subject it to the same rule?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
the three
Yeah.
or the attendance rule?
Uh-huh.
And then the committee
What's
that
the
they're
attendance?
the committee that they're coming from could then reappoint someone who can make
I
quorum.
think that's why we noted the staff liaison would share that attendance between the two boards so that they would know that there's an attendance issue.
So that
From the
way we'll make
appointing
sure they're
board.
getting dinged on the attendance, both on their home board
Mhm.
and on their liaison board. Does that, you know what I mean? Keeping
Yes,
track.
yeah, yes, I follow you, yes.
Yeah.
But
Andy, go ahead.
does it matter that the two boards are in communication if it's ultimately the clerk that's going to be registering whether someone's missed 3 or not from the one
Clerk's
that
going to need like a slide rule, I think, for,
an abacus.
Slide rule,
yeah.
showing your age.
Anyways, those are details that I don't need to get into.
Does that make sense, Mr. Manager, to be keeping track of that attendance, that liaisonship attendance, taken out of that and replaced or whatever?
Yes, I think
That's a Wesley question.
there's
Is that something that,
If they're a voting member already, if they're a voting member of that particular board, even though they're a liaison, I think they're subject to the.
it will already be subject to the attendance rule? That's right.
I do think the key there, though, Wesley, is for you to notify the board that's supposed to be receiving information from the other one so that they know to appoint someone to, you know what I mean?
If they're not attending their liaison board, notify both boards, both staff liaisons.
That makes
Yeah,
it across the board.
exactly. Yeah. We're going to have a running list of
Yeah.
attendance violators.
Saying comes from
Damon,
across the
I
board.
found that 30% attendance very low. And it sounds like from the language you can have an exemption for health, family emergency reasons, what have you. So if you set that aside, 30% attendance seems low to me for advisory board meetings. I mean, I would expect more.
I think it's if you miss 30%.
Oh, it's missing 30. Oh, got you. Okay.
Right. Okay. We have a request from the Climate Action Team. I'm moving on to another item here in the hopes that we're going to get out of here very, very soon. I wonder if actually, Mr. Manager, we can allow all of our guests to get home to their families.
Yes.
Glad that y'all are still here. Is that I think we just want to talk about the Climate Action Team at this point.
Yes.
So I think we're done with everything else.
Just thank you all very much for being here tonight. Thank you. Okay.
Unless you want to stay and listen to the rest of this, which you're more than welcome to do.
The beeline for the door. They have-
Laura's.
I really, again, appreciate you all being here. It's really fantastic to have you smiling at us. Do we need any staff to stay, Mr. Manager?
Laura, go home.
I think
Action
this can
team.
do without.
Yeah, you're
I
fine,
don't think
yeah.
we need any staff to stay unless you really want to.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, thank you.
Get out of here.
So the immediate issue before us is that we have a request, I understand, from the Climate Action Team to expand the number of seats on the Climate Action Team. Sammy, can you share Sammy and Randy, can you share with us the reason?
Yeah, it's like Randy earlier summarized that, being an advisory or a team that is doing a lot of work in the community, they can use more help. And that's really what's driving this. And there is a lot of
On
interest.
that engagement stuff.
Yes.
So I guess I would be interested in hearing from other council members and also from the manager about why we would or wouldn't do this, honor this request. It sounds like we have applicants who want to get in there and start doing it. Is there, what?
Yeah, and Trish is here as well. Again, it's my understanding that there were a number of applicants who wanted to be on the Climate Action Team, and so they wanted to appoint them all, is what I understood. That's how we got here. Plus the help, do the work, but they had a number of applicants who wanted to be on here.
I guess I just want to be very clear that, and this is tying back into Randy's earlier comments about the sort of engagement-oriented function that this advisory board in particular is meant to play, that the work that these extra additional seats will want to be doing really is around that engagement work, and that we are hoping to get some kind of advice from the staff about how to structure that in a way that it's not going to overburden the staff liaison in trying to achieve that mission for that board to be more engagement oriented in the community. So I think that's why I just raised that as a concern. I don't want to just like throw a bunch more people into the room and all of a sudden they still don't have a good structure to work under for doing their engagement work without destroying all of Laura's time, right?
And I understand that's part of the issue as well as an agreement on what are those activities and how many are they actually will undertake within a year is part of what I'm understanding as well. It's not clear either. I thought there was a certain number, maybe 2 per year or so, that they had initially agreed upon, but it seems like that is growing somewhat. And so that's creating a demand on staff.
I think that's the question I have, though, is what if this climate action team has decided, they want to be doing a bunch of different engagement activities throughout the community? It seems to me what we need is some advice on how to make sure, A, they're representing themselves properly, not as the town, not as whatever. They are representing themselves as engagement ambassadors from the climate action team or whatever. And also, secondarily, that they're not expecting a lot from staff to contribute to those activities. Randy, go
It goes
ahead.
back to your comments about the racial equity commission and climate action teams on here as well. We talked about that, about community engagement and how they represent themselves, all of that. So we got that. So, okay.
So,
Randy.
yeah, so the reason why this is we're moving into a different realm, so to speak, especially with the climate action team, is there's a green neighborhood initiative, and in rolling that out, community members are going to approach the climate action team and approach Laura with requests. So there's a whole other component to this that may not fall into how many events that they run. But let's just look at the spring, okay? There's Creek Week, there's the Pollinator Week, there's the tree plantings, and those are not even major events, but they are tied to volunteer efforts. So, having an expanded team may create these subcommittees that can do the work.
Don't say subcommittee.
What?
Don't say subcommittee. No, go ahead. I'm just kidding.
Well, but so in my view, creating a larger membership has the opportunity to develop how each one of those kinds of activities can be organized and executed. And we can do an assessment. We can give it a 1-year assessment to see, okay, if you've got 15 people, what does that look like in terms of how they organize themselves to do certain things that we already now know are on the list, not even to include, some of the community support around green neighborhood initiatives. So I think that it gives us the manpower, so to speak, to drive some of the green neighborhood initiatives.
I think the difficulty that's going to raise is one that Richard pointed out a minute ago, which is who's identifying what these activities are and making sure that it's them doing the work and not the staff.
But some of them
And also
are
what the
already
purpose
identified, which I don't mean like an event like Earth Day. I'm talking about, Invasive Species Week, the tree arbor week or whatever it is, the pollinator week, monarch butterflies, Creek Week. That's already like 5. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, if that's all handed off from staff to the climate action team, it may look different. And it may have a different level of community involvement. Because right now, those are very much staff driven. And that's what I'm saying. That could be part of the package, so to speak, that the climate action team could take under their wing. And I'm just putting it out there because it already exists and it needs to have some of the the people power behind it to drive it. And they also, if you have 15
Richard wants to
people,
add something.
they may engage other community groups.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I get the idea of increasing the team for more volunteers, more help, but I guess I'm just wondering, do they have to be appointed members to get the same effect? I guess we appointed 9 for some reason to perform the duties of a charge, I guess. And it's a charge, those things you're spelling out now, is that? I guess I'm trying to figure out, yeah, do they have to actually be members of the climate action team to help the existing team do that work?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I would increase the membership and see. I would pilot it because that's the only way we're going to know is let's see how that unfolds. This is what they have asked for. You know, this is part of this engagement piece.
I mean, I think the reality is that it's not going to be a pilot. If we increase the number of seats, we're not going to reduce it later on. But just to
No,
be
but-
realistic about it. But
Right, but
I
at
get what
least
you're
you
saying.
get to see how we assess it. We can say we will assess this.
we might think about if we do this, maybe we loosen the quorum requirement on that one, because I start to worry about you appoint 15 people and suddenly half of them realize they didn't actually have the interest they thought they had. Or you know what I mean? Like maybe the quorum requirement stays what it is now, which is
Right.
51% of 9.
Yeah.
But we add. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sammy, go ahead.
Well, I mean, you know, if we're going to be stricter about attendance, I don't think quorum, as long as maybe quorum is of who is appointed, not how many seats there are, right? That's how it is, right? So it shouldn't be an issue. I mean, 3 misses and we lose that person who's making an issue with quorum. I just want to note that, you know, there's 3 other advisory boards that are 1 less than what we're talking or they're requesting. The Arts Committee is 12 seats. Recreation and Parks is 12. We were talking about 13 because we didn't want to have a situation where
I don't have a conceptual problem with like adding more members to this advisory board. My caution is impact on staff and staying on course with their charge, right? Like that's.
Yeah, and I think those are separate issues. If there's an issue
They are
with
separate
charge,
issues.
then it doesn't have anything
Yeah, I
to
agree
do
they're
with
separate issues, but there's other
size.
things I'm kind of thinking about
Yeah.
is like, why are we doing this in terms of the charge? And is this going to, making sure that we're guarding staff's time and not pulling them even further into.
Yeah, and I think one thing that would help is this clarification, for example, that we've already requested both tonight and at the climate agenda, like clarifying what roles like members of a board can take on, you know, what degree of representing the town, those kinds of things. And then it's for staff to say, you know, what your capacity is in terms of, you know, I think that can be negotiated.
I think I just want to make sure that it's not staff negotiating with the advisory board about their staff effort, because again, advisory board's role is not to advise staff, et cetera, which we talked about.
Yeah, there's a charge, and I presume that's what we're going to stick to. And if there's a request for a change, then there'll be a motion by that board, and we'll be in a similar situation talking about the content of what they do, not the quantity of people trying to do it.
Right.
Okay. We are now past 10 o'clock, just noting that for time. And I think we're right near the edge here of adjournment.
Yeah, I'd like to go ahead and do it. But I would also like to, you know, I think we are going to have some other stuff. Randy's already alluded to a couple boards. I can imagine Community Safety Task Force building toward this issue. I think it may be worth having concrete language about town representation come through, you know, just to nail down. I mean, I think we're all pretty interested in organizing people into being able to do more. But we have to be pretty careful. So I think, you know, I don't think this board going to 15 is likely to put undue stress on this right now, but I think within the next couple of quarters, we should really nail down parameters for town representation from like organized board members.
With training.
So am I safe in saying that everybody's okay with increasing the number of seats on this climate action team?
And also interested.
And we've already got on the list is some language from staff around how to structure the way that these so-called engagement boards engage. I think Richard's already got that on his list. So, Mr. Manager, we'll look for an ordinance change about the climate action team coming to a meeting soon. Not today, we cannot. Not during work session. But that's what I'm saying. We'll look for an ordinance. We need an ordinance change from staff to change the composition of the board, and then we'll also have, presumably on the same agenda, an opportunity to appoint these members to the board.
Move to adjourn.
I have a motion from Danny to adjourn.
Second.
Oh, wait. So just one second, Richard. So
Withdraw.
There
Table.
Richard.
I just want to ask a question about the potential consolidation. Are you all finished with that discussion, or is that
I just want to, I'll reiterate my request, and then others can weigh in about whether they share this interest. I would like to know more about what Chapel Hill did when they recently, as in within the last 5 to 10 years, I don't remember when it was, totally redid their advisory board stuff. They consolidated some things, they renamed some things, they did a bunch of different stuff with their advisory board, and I just don't remember the details from that time. So I'm interested in continuing that conversation, but I want to do it with something to anchor the conversation.
And I thought Wesley's research was really helpful, looking at advisory board members of similarly sized towns, North Carolina, looking at Hillsborough. I think similar sized towns were 6 or 8 advisory boards.
And I have to say, I think that this brings us a little bit full circle to the comment about diversity interests, right? I do think that if we have too many advisory boards, for example, and we're having trouble filling them, that's harming our interests in making sure that our boards are diverse too, right? So I think we can meet multiple interests here by rethinking the way we do some of this.
So how do you want that to come back, though? I mean, is that an agenda item or?
Maybe start with an information item or a memo, just for more information.
Okay.
I'd be curious on any recommendations on words that could be combined.
I agree.
Can we get from 21 to?
Let's get some information first, and then we'll see maybe if some recommendations come forward.
Before the motion, I to adjourn. About the consolidation and just being really careful and thoughtful about that, because you don't want to dilute one issue, with another, and you don't want the issues to have equal attention. So that would be another consideration.
It'll definitely take some conversation and consideration. Yeah. I'm just happy we're starting to get some people appointed to these boards again and getting these quorum issues taken care of. And I, again, just thankful to Wesley for helping make that happen, and to our staff liaisons. Okay.
For this climate one, can we do it soon so we can make the appointments, Mr. Manager? Is that something that could be?
Yes, we have it either the next meeting, the 21st or 28th is on the agenda.
Okay, thanks.
All right. There's a motion by Danny and a second by Barb.
We didn't talk about what Randy had brought up, and not necessarily tonight, but I know about the diversity on the advisory boards, and that certainly can go on the next discussion.
I mean, I guess
we have it baked in, but I didn't know if there was something extra Randy wanted to share.
Well, I just think it goes with the question of, of quorum. It definitely will go into the question of consolidation. I just think it's smart for us to have a discussion and know where we're all coming from in terms of, how do we help to meet the diversity expectations that we've set for ourselves? And what other things that we could be doing, and what does diversity look like? So I think there's a whole bunch of little
talk more
questions.
about that. I mean, I think right now we have our policy. I think we've been, Wesley's made a really strong point about following the policy as it's currently written. And if council members have some interest in revisiting that policy or strengthening it in some way, then we should set some time to converse about that. But I think that's not going to happen tonight because my ability to form sentences is quickly diminishing. But thank you for raising the point. It's very important because I think it's threaded through all of this.
We'll talk about it again. Come back.
Okay. I am now recognizing Councilmember Nowell to make a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Barbara is going to second the motion. All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The matter passes unanimously. Thanks, everybody.
Our meeting we've had.
It was productive, though, right?
It was.